All right, hello everybody out there. Welcome to Comic Book Radio. I'm your host, Peter Cimetti. This is episode 231. Tonight, my guest is Dennis Stone. Dennis is over there at America's Stonehenge in Salem, New Hampshire. Some people know it as Mystery Hill. We're going to be talking about that tonight. It's an esoteric Saturday on Comic Book Radio, so we usually dive into topics that are like supernatural, paranormal, the unknown, the unexplained, stuff that just fuels my storytelling as a comic creator. So I'm curious as to how this conversation will go tonight, because I love this area. I've been there before. I'm very interested in learning more directly, especially from Dennis, and I hope you guys are interested too. Now, before we get started, I do want to say hello to those of you that are in the chat. We have Cole King here. What's up, Cole? Good to see you. Thank you for being here tonight. We got Comics for Life here as well, too. What's up, Comics for Life? You always got such good questions. So I wonder if you're going to have any tonight, because we're going to be diving deep into this topic, and it's a very, very interesting topic. At least I think so. I'm sure Dennis thinks so. But I have a feeling you're going to come up with some pretty good questions. We got Shrek PMC here. What's up, Shrek? And again, thank you for being on the show last night. You took a big dive into that open mic water. It's a bit uncharted territory, but you did well. You did well. All right, so everybody's going to start coming in slowly but surely for this show. Now, I do want to say one thing. This doesn't have to do with America's Stonehenge, but it does have to do with a little book called Blood Moon. Blood Moon right now is 43% funded with 20 days left, and Ancient Evil threatens to control all dimensions in Blood Moon, the King Cryptid and Blood Realm crossover graphic novel. You can go get that on alternacomics.com/bloodmoon, or you can go to Indiegogo for that. Check it out on there, back wherever you prefer. All right, so let's bring him on. Give a big Comic Book Radio welcome to this fella, the man of the hour, Mr. Dennis Stone. What's up, Dennis? Dennis, can you hear me? Dennis, are you there? Uh-oh. Are we having technical difficulties?
Hey, Pete, if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
I don't know if I'm on the show yet, but I cannot hear a thing.
Oh, that's not good. That's so weird. Everything was fine before we started the show. You can't hear anything? That's strange.
Sorry, Pete, if you can hear me. All of a sudden, the audio completely cut out. I don't know if it's on. I don't think it's on my end. I really didn't do anything, but I don't know if you can hear me, but I cannot hear anything at all whatsoever.
Okay, try getting out. Well, if you can't hear me, what a way to start. It's a live show. You guys know that. See if you can hear me at all. If you can see if you can get out and then come back in. So get out and then come back in. I'm gonna kick you out. I'm gonna kick you out and try to come back in, Dennis. I don't want to kick him, but I'm gonna have to. All right, I'm gonna kick him out. Hopefully he can come back in. Man. I gotta tell you though, when I was over, I don't know how close he is to America's Stonehenge. I think he lives relatively close to it, if not on the same property. When I was over there, there's some weird interference with electronics. Things didn't really work when you wanted them to work. Much like tonight. When we started the show, when we were talking behind the scenes, everything was okay. There was a slight delay talking to Dennis, but wasn't anything too crazy. All right, let's see. He joined again. Let's see if we can get him here. Dennis, can you hear me?
Hi, Pete. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you now. Let me pull you down. Actually, I can pull it. Yeah, I'm going to pull it. Yeah, I can see you now.
Are
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
fantastic. Are you on your phone?
I am, yeah, and
Okay.
everything was fine, but all of a sudden everything just completely went quiet, you know. So, but
That's
I
weird.
can
Has
hear
that ever
you.
happened before?
I have seen that in the past, not lately with StreamYard or any other platform, but yeah, I've had some issues in the past a few years ago. You know, I think things are better now, but yeah, all of a sudden you were just talking and then it was absolutely nothing, and I really hadn't touched anything, you know. So, but you're
Yeah.
loud and clear now. I apologize for that.
All right, no problem. All right, let's get things going. Everybody, give him a big welcome again. This time he can hear you. Dennis, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I'm really interested in learning a lot about America's Stonehenge here. Uh, this is a really old site. You said what? It's like 4,000 years old, and there's some interesting things there. I noticed when I was there, I feel a certain energy. There's like a silence, a tranquility to it. There's something different than just a normal trip into the woods. There's just it's hard to explain.
Mm.
It's like when I went there, there was like a nice feeling of being able to kind of center myself a bit.
Mm.
Has anyone ever commented about anything like that?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I mean, I go up with my dog all the time. We live on the northwest side of the property. We bought a couple of acres back in the mid '80s so that it abutted this property, and we take a walk up there pretty much every night. And some of my neighbors too that are close to us walk their dog up there, and it seems to be a lot of kind of peace and I would say kind of tranquility and quietness. And I was on a radio show with some people. It was kind of a show with four of us on it, and all of they're from Michigan, from out in let's see, out in Minnesota, and they had all been out to our place just recently. They all flew out and everything. And one of the comments they made on the show was the peace and tranquility of the place. You know, kind of an energy kind of thing. You know, and they got into that a
Yeah,
little bit, so that was kind of cool. But we've heard that over the years. You know, I don't sense any negativity up there. There's been very little of that. But most people feel peace, and we have a lot of celebrations too. You know, people come up for the solstices and equinoxes, and that seems to be even a more special time for that kind of thing. You know, the equinox is coming up pretty quick, as a matter of fact. So we'll be
yeah,
celebrating that. Yeah.
yeah. I really enjoy it up there. It's great.
Well, thank
And
you.
yeah. Now, how how did this come into, I guess, into your possession here?
Yeah, it was a poker game, you know, a few years ago, and but actually it was a radio show going back in 1955. It was on a WBZ radio out of Boston, and my dad used to listen to a show on Friday nights. Started at 7:30. It was called Yankee Yarns, and it had been on since the 1940s. The talk show host was Alton Hall Blackington, a native of Maine, and the show was syndicated all over New England, but BZ can pretty much pick it up anywhere, AM, you know. My dad was in Labrador in the early 50s and used to listen to WBZ up there to stay in touch with home, you know, way before internet and all of that stuff, you know, and long distance phone calls. So the show that evening was all about these stone ruins in Salem, New Hampshire, and now known as America's Stonehenge. And he had never heard of this place before. He was quite taken by the show, and he only lived 7 miles from it, which is even more surprising that he had never heard of it. Um, so after that show, he was at a barber shop just a couple of days later and waiting to have his hair cut. He's looking at a magazine and he's flipping through it and he sees a whole article about the same site, which kind of surprised him, plus all the pictures. Now he could see what it looked like. And he was really drawn to it. And he asked the barber. The barber's name is Warren Haywood. This was in Derry, New Hampshire, and Warren used to race horses at Rockingham Racetrack, as a matter of fact. But his main line of work was being a barber, and I had him as a really young kid there in the 50s and 60s. And my dad said, can I take this with me? And he goes, well, how old is that magazine? He goes, well, it's 1952. It's been sitting here for 3 years. And I said, sure, take it with him. And the name of the magazine was New Hampshire Profile Magazine. And it's no longer in print, but it's kind of like a Yankee magazine for New
Hmm.
Hampshire, if you would. And it was a whole feature about our site. So at my aunt and uncle's that weekend playing cards up in Derry, the same town, about 10 people. And as you're playing cards, my dad at some point brought out the magazine and passed it around to everybody. And again, nobody knew what this place was until it got to my mom's sister, my aunt. And she and her husband both saw it and said, wait a minute, we used to picnic there back in the 1930s. So kind of another coincidence there, So my dad was pretty excited about that and said, hey, can you find this place? And they said, wow, it's been 20 years. The place is not open to the public. There's no road signs because they didn't have Google Maps back in those days. So that Sunday, the four of them took off, left me behind. I was about 18 months old, and I must have stayed with the grandparents. And they drove around North Salem, New Hampshire, trying to find this place. And finally, a road, kind of an old dirt road, looked familiar to my aunt and uncle. They parked the car, took a chance, walked a half a mile up the hill, and they found the place. And so my dad then climbed underneath the chain link fence. If you recall, when you were there, there's like a big green chain link fence around the site.
Yep.
And he climbed underneath that, kind of trespassing, and he was in there by himself. The other three stayed outside. They didn't want to climb under this, and get hurt or whatever with the wire and everything. So when he came back out, quite a while later, they said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Well," he said, "I've never seen anything quite like this. This is, kind of blew his mind, basically." He also mentioned he'd like to get involved with research of this place. He always liked archaeology. That was one of his things, history and archaeology. And he said maybe open it up to the public as some sort of a museum or attraction at some point. Because my mom's comment was something about you got rocks in your head, because at that point he had a new job at AT&T Bell Labs as an engineer. They were building a home. Actually, they were building it themselves with the help of some relatives. I was 18 months and my sister was due shortly thereafter. So I'm sure and my dad actually was going to Merrimack College in Massachusetts too. So he was doing a whole bunch of stuff going on there, and all they needed is this place, So, but that didn't stop my dad. He continued on. He met the owner of the place. And 3 years later, in 1958, actually on the summer solstice, coincidentally, they did kind of a soft opening to the public for the first time. And I believe it was July 11th, 1958, that they actually had the official opening. And a governor came up, and some of the local politicians showed up and local people came up for the opening. And so we've been open 66 years. So I kind of grew up with the place, I had really no choice. And
Wow.
I feel kind of fortunate to have a lot of good memories going back, even to the 50s when we first opened. So
Well,
today
it
is
must
our
be meant to be, just given your last name.
Yeah, it was meant to be. It's kind of like preordained, And I would say we've done a lot of radio shows since 1970, and they always bring that up. Has your last name been changed? Is that your real name? And it is our real name. So I guess it was meant to be or preordained, and it had to be. So, but it works great. So now I have a granddaughter. I have one son, Kelsey. He's 35. He's an engineer like my dad was. He worked at Raytheon. And my granddaughter is almost 4 years. 9/11, she'll be 4 years old this year. And she's like the fourth generation. So it's been kind of a family affair for about 7 decades now.
Wow, that's
and,
great.
Yeah, I had a full-time career too. In 1970s, I tried to go into the military and fly. I went through a whole physical thing and everything. And they said, well, everything is perfect on you. Everything came out great. I think there was an interview, physical and psychological or something, whatever they did. It was 51 years ago. They said, the only thing, your eyes are not, you got nearsightedness, you're partly colorblind, and you also got depth perception. I said, what does that mean? He goes, you're never going to fly an aircraft for the military, So I did it on my own starting in 74. And I ended up at American Airlines flying as a captain at the end of my career. So that worked out pretty well. And I retired in 2016. But on my days off, we always worked at the museum. I'd work like a 4-day airline trip, and then I'd come home, and my wife would give me a list of things that broke at the museum while I was gone. And I'd be there working on that, and also greeting customers and doing a lot of yard. We have about 110 acres here, so there's a lot of work on the the whole property. It's just continuous. It's never ending, So
Yeah.
So we're there every day pretty much. Yeah.
Now, to your knowledge, how much of the property, the whole entire area, is documented in terms of how old it is?
So there are 16 carbon datings that were taken starting in 1967, and the last one was done on a bone last year. There's also 4 what they call optically stimulated luminescence testing. It's called OSL. It's a geological test to tell when soil or dirt saw the light the last time, if you will. And so the University of Washington, Dr. Feathers came out, and in 9/11/2020, after some preparation, and I guess we knew 2 months in advance they wanted to take some cores from our site and do some dating. Um, and so on that day, about 24 people came up, and we had two Brookhaven National Laboratory physicists. They're both from Europe originally, and I got to work side by side with them. They're kind of crossing over to archaeology. And Dr. Feathers from the University of Washington has been working on OSL since the late 80s. He kind of crosses over into physics, if you will. And so they all work together as a team of about 24 people. In the meantime, my daughter-in-law was in an emergency C-section for my granddaughter the whole day, and my granddaughter came at 4:30 in the afternoon. In the meantime, I'm trying to, work with these people on two different areas of the hilltop collecting samples, and it was a whole day thing, and it was pretty nerve-wracking. So I'll never forget that day or her birthday. Um, so we have got datings going back as early 4,000 years on the main site. That was a radiocarbon datings. The OSL dates, two of the samples were rock samples. They did not test. And he gives an explanation of perhaps why they didn't test. But the two sediment or dirt samples did test. And that was pretty cool. One of them was from the Oracle Chamber, if you recall, the largest chamber on the site near what we call the sacrificial table. The roof of that actually had much greater depth of soil than I would have ever imagined. My whole life I thought it was just several inches deep. It's actually up to 24 inches deep there. And so when I was first contacted to do this project, they said, choose a couple candidates, and it has to be undisturbed soil, chipmunk holes, where people have dug already and backfilled won't count. Any kind of light that gets into a trees uprooting, that kind of thing, it won't work. It will contaminate. Anything with light will contaminate the dirt, and it will ruin the test. So they actually took a core from there, and that core, 2 years later, you get the results back. They put dosimeters in the hole. They measure radioactivity for a year, and they come back and collect that. Then a year later, you get the results back. And it showed that dirt on that chamber was there and hadn't seen the light since about 1550 AD. So what Dr. Feathers has said, well, the chamber was sitting there and the dirt came in later. Obviously, you don't build a chamber underneath the dirt. You build the chamber, the stone roof, big, huge roof slabs, and then the dirt comes in later, either by natural deposit, wind-blown soil and particles, about an inch every 125 years. That's just an average, though. Or somebody shoveling dirt on top of the roof, that kind of thing. So that chamber dates back, it's pre-colonial, if you will. It could be hundreds and hundreds of years it had been sitting there before that dirt accumulated. Another one was a wall in front of another chamber, and that dated to 1400 AD. So these are minimum dates, if you will. It doesn't say when the structures were built. It just shows that the dirt was there after the structure was constructed. And these are pre-colonial, and that other one was a pre-Columbian date on that. And they did 22 other sites from here to Virginia. There are possibly about 800 structures or sites similar to ours. It could be just a chamber or multiple chambers like our site, from Quebec and Ontario, Canada, all the way down to Virginia. And they did 22 places out of all of those. They did 22 places. And the results coming back were, again, pre-colonial and somewhere pre-Columbian dates. And again, it's not when the structure was built. It's just, it gives you a minimum date, So you had a chamber sitting there and the dirt builds up next to it or on top of it, that kind of thing, But the hilltop is about 110 acres. And the more we explore the outside, the more things we're finding. And when I retired in 2016 from American, I didn't get bored at all. You have a lifestyle of flying. It's a whole lifestyle, being an airline pilot or flight attendant, anything like that. You're gone, and and some of my crew members, we used to talk about these places, and they were fascinated by this. We'd have a 3-hour flight or whatever it was, and we discussed this, and most of them have never heard of this, before, like probably a lot of your listeners, It was an unknown topic, but it killed time. And the next leg, we'd be talking about more of this, And they said, will you be bored when you retire? Because I flew for 42 years total. And I said, I don't think so, And that year, I started finding what we call serpent walls up there. I don't know if I sent you a picture of a serpent wall, or when you visited, you happened to see any, but they're new since 2016. And a serpent wall is a snake. It has a head, a body, and a tail. And I found my first one in that spring of 2016, and it's about 27 feet long. I walked over to it. I've been by it many, many times. It's near one of our snowshoe trails. I ride my ATVs and snowmobiles, and I snowshoe on it about 65 feet away. But the light hit it that day, and it was away to my dad, where my dad used to live. He died in 2009. This is 7 years later. And I was kind of going in that direction, maybe doing some trail maintenance. And I happened to look over and I said, that looks rather strange. I had never noticed it looking like that, just the way the sunlight hit it. I walked over, it was on a ridge of bedrock. It looked like it had a stone head, a body that tapered down to a flat stone at the tail. I said, that looks like like a tail, and it looked like a serpent to me, but I'm like, am I seeing things? I had no frame of reference. I started showing it to some people. They also kind of thought, yeah, possibly, but are there any others? Is this just something that looks like a serpent? It's just a coincidence, or pareidolia, looking at something like a face in a cloud, but it's not really there. So we started finding other ones with different shapes, S shapes and shapes with a 90-degree head or a 90-degree tail. In that spring through the summer, I don't know if you're familiar with Scott Walters from America on Earth. He was up there that spring, late spring.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Alan Butler from England and his wife. There's about 20 people in the entourage, and I showed them that, and they were all kind of blown away by that, Scott had already done in one of his episodes the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio, and he also did a serpent mound, I believe, in Ontario, and then he went over to Scotland, and there was a stone wall shaped like a serpent in Scotland, so he was already familiar with that. And so we started finding more of these, went to a meeting in Connecticut, and near Gunjee a site near the Navy base in Groton, Connecticut. It was an archaeological meeting at a Holiday Inn, and a gentleman, one of the gentlemen speaking was from Connecticut, and I have to pick his book up before he spoke, and I'm flipping through it. It said 8,000 structures, 270 photographs, 25 categories of structures. I'm like, well, that's really interesting. It must be the whole Northeast. Somebody finally did a book about the whole Northeast. It wasn't. It was just about the town of North Stonington, Connecticut. 35,000 acres. There's 8,000 structures. The chambers that you see at our site, even the standing stones, cairns, linear cairns. And when I kept flipping through it, I started finding the serpent walls. He has a whole chapter in serpent walls, and I'm like, that's what we have at our site. It turns out they have about 400 serpent walls in that one town, and they measure 30 feet up to about 300 feet. The average is about 90 feet, I think he said. And his name is Mark Star, actually. And they can be linear, like just perfectly straight, like the first one I found. They can be rectilinear, like a 90-degree head, 90-degree tail. Some are S-shaped. And what we found at our site is what we think are serpents biting their tails, the Ouroboros. And we think we have 3 of those today. And that's all since 2016. We keep learning all of this, So that one town has about 400 of them. And then we found out right after he spoke and did his PowerPoint for 1 hour, and he's showing all the things we have at our site, every type of structure. A lady from Colorado in Denver spoke with her 2 male colleagues, and she talked about some counties just east of Denver, below Nebraska. We've been in that area before. She mentions the counties. She starts to show cairns, linear cairns with little chambers in them, just like Mark Starr had shown in his previous PowerPoint, but much more open and flatter countryside. Stonington's pretty hilly, rocky, swampy. And then she shows her serpentine walls, and it's like one of them had, it was just like one of our, and it has a triangular head. It could have been like a twin to it, and it had like a body that went behind it straight or linear. And she starts to show some others. Since that time, we found the serpent walls are in Winnipeg, Canada. Pox Canada is working on them now, and hopefully they take them very seriously. Maybe that will prompt some of our institutions like the National Geographic or some university, or maybe the Smithsonian or somebody will say, wait a minute, you may mistake some of our chambers for root cellars, but you can't mistake a serpentine wall for farmers' walls. Farmers' walls are all over the Northeast. They say there's 240,000 miles of them. But they're made out of kind of rounded field stones, and they usually go fairly straight. And they were made actually to clear fields of stone, of course, and also create a fence, like a stock fence, and sometimes boundaries. And sometimes they served all 3 purposes. And they go back to about the mid-1700s. I guess before that, people were building mostly wooden fences, and then they get into the stone wall building, and, New England is just covered. And they're historical walls, But this is a different thing. Our walls they turn, they twist, they bend. My dad even knew that back in the 50s. He goes, these walls don't look like farmers' walls. And Mr. Goodwin, our first researcher, starting in 1937, also kind of and he wrote 4 books, and he mentions that the walls are very unusual here. And they also contain big slabs of stone versus farmers' walls, which is usually rounded field stones,
Do they seem to have some kind of structural purpose? Are they keeping something out? Are they holding something in? Anything like that?
No, they don't. They don't seem to be. I mean, you can step over them, even though the soil has built up next to them. That slow, earth. They call it paleogenesis. It's just the creation of earth as earth leaves and debris slowly building up next to the wall. The walls are pretty short. I have a small Nova Scotia duck-toling retriever, and she hopped over to. She's not supposed to. We don't want her jumping on the walls, knocking rocks down or anything, but she does. She jumps over the walls. There's no problem. So they're not really stock fences. And they do. They turn, twist, and bend, and some only run like 20 feet, and they don't go anywhere. They don't do anything. They don't seem to be for any defensive purposes, whatever. But they do have these big slabs of stone, either stacked up on top of each other. And Mark Starr calls that lacework. He has the same kind of, I guess, kind of an architectural, arrangement of the stones. But some of the big slabs are actually stood on their end, longitudinally, kind of stood up, and we call them orthostats. Now, on the main site, we have the same kind of stones, but they hold up roof slabs on top, like the east-west chamber. So these walls have a totally different flavor. And then, of course, when you have that wall that was made OSL dated to 1400, it kind of also adds to the fact that they're not something that farmers are building, since the 1750s, roughly,
Yeah.
And these walls are in New York, the Hudson Valley, Dutchess, Putnam, and Westchester have about 500 chambers. These could be chambers you can walk into, standing stones,
Oh yeah.
boulders,
Yeah.
legs, the whole thing. But now they're looking a little closer, and they're finding some of the walls that they didn't pay as much attention to, because they're kind of hiding in the thicket too. Like a lot of our serpent walls are just hiding behind brush. You just all these years going by it. Once you clear it, it's like, how did we miss that? All these decades. They're finding them in the Hudson Valley, but they're in Alabama too. And a gentleman from Jacksonville State University has been working on his serpent wall since the 1970s. He's a doctor of archaeology, and he's invited us down there. We were just down in Alabama this year, but we didn't get a chance to see him. He's got a 40 square mile area with gigantic cairns, which are big piles of rocks, standing stones, and other kind of stone features. But one of his types of features he calls rattlesnake walls. And we've seen photographs of them, and we sent them some of our data. And so he's aware of us, and we're aware of him. But he's been working on this since about almost 50 years. He's been working on his rattlesnake walls. So they're from Winnipeg to Alabama. They're from actually Colorado. And right after that, we found out, I think about 3 years ago, they're in what is called Weed, California. It's right by Mount Shasta, not too far from Redding. They have wall patterns that same serpent walls, and then they have others that are chevron shaped and also zigzag. And that's what we have at our site. They have those at North Stonington, and they have them elsewhere. They've been finding them too. It's some of the other 800 sites.
Is there any evidence to suggest that these are the same kinds of people that built all of these structures?
Yeah, Pete, that's the greatest. When you start to find them, not only in the Northeast, you start to find them further out, like Winnipeg or near Denver, or even on the West Coast. It starts to add more questions. Were these people in contact with one another? Are they the same culture? Why do we have the same kind of wall patterns? 3,000 miles separation. That's a great question. I think once they start, maybe they can do more OSL dating. I mean, Dr. Feathers should be going down to. I don't know if he has actually go down and get permission to take some cores. And then when you start to get some of the dates back, maybe some of the building or the construction took place in a similar time, or perhaps it's over a much broader time period. But Native Americans and other people would probably trade to the next tribe, and that would continue, right across the continent. Perhaps some of these ideas may have followed them. We don't have a good answer right now. There are about 95 serpent mounds. The Great Serpent Mound in Ohio we visited last year is 1,350 feet long. But there are 95 of those going out to Iowa. And those folks that were in from Michigan, and I mentioned from Minnesota too, but the people from Michigan, they run their own show up there. That we were on their show, basically, a husband and wife. They said one of their serpent walls recently, not walls, one of the serpent mounds in Michigan just got bulldozed. It is now destroyed, which is sad, and that's happening since some of the stonework. Yeah, it's really sad because you work with a contractor, you might be able to get them to build around it, leave it there and build around it. But if they're not aware of that, it may not be any kind of like they're being mean or anything. They're just like, oh, just a wall, and we got to do our project. Yeah, so if you can educate people, most people.
That makes me think of back in Ireland when they bulldozed through like a fairy mound.
Oh,
And
yeah.
they were like, you really shouldn't have done that. And they put a highway through it, and
Oh,
a
yeah.
lot of tragedy on that highway.
That similar thing happened on Route 9, 495 around Boston back in the 60s. A lot of the highway construction in the 50s and 60s. And my dad got down where the highway was going, and I could have been with him. I have a vague memory of being there. And actually, he's got photographs of kind of the beehive kind of chambers. They're right where 495 is today, and unfortunately, they didn't like build around them, leave them in the medium strip. They were all bulldozed away. There's no
Oh,
trace of
man.
them. Which is so the same thing happens here. And it could be just kind of ignorance. Not as a they just don't know. They don't have the information. That kind of
Yeah,
that kind
yeah.
of ignorance. You know what I mean? Not to be negative towards these people, but if you tell them about it and then they still do it, it's like, why did you do that? So yeah, we're kind of worried about these sites being protected. That's why these radio shows, we certainly appreciate being on your show so much, because if we can spread the word a little bit about protecting these, they're not all built by farmers, and even those are historical, but we think we have a very prehistoric past. And one of our researchers with us for over 40 years, Dr. David Stewart Smith, before he died in 2016, he said, I think we've got an ancient culture or lithic culture, stone building culture across the Northeast that's been unrecognized. It's been kind of ignored by mainstream academia and archaeologists and scholars, and also ridiculed to some, saying, "Oh, they're nothing more than just a bunch of crazy farmers building these things," and that's led to some of these no longer being in existence, being destroyed basically.
Yeah, they don't
The
treat it seriously.
Exactly. So that's what we're trying to do. Get the word out there. If you see anything that looks very unusual, like especially these serpent walls or stone chambers, anything like that, standing monoliths that don't look natural, or like, farmers did put up gate posts and stuff like that. They usually have little drill marks, the plug and feather, the star drill. Those are pretty obvious, when you see something historical. Starting in the late 1700s, they started using the star drill and the plug and feather, the split stones. And you see that little drill holes all over that kind of stonework, but these ancient people didn't use that, and that's what Dr. David Stewart Smith also found, that all over our hill are slabs of stone that were actually detached from the bedrock. And the first one was found in 1982 up near the North Stone, which is aligned with Polaris today. It's about maybe 100 feet from that monolith. Northwest of it, one of our staff, Mary Kramer, was having a picnic lunch in the summer of '82, just sitting there on the stone. And she had already been advised by Dr. David Stewart Smith. Our whole staff had been, look for stones that might be propped up, big slabs that might be raised, perhaps. Maybe they have a stone underneath them holding them up. And also, the edge of it might be serrated, little dimpling on it. That might be an indication that they were actually dressing or shaping the stone in a manner of like you do an arrowhead, the napping, the percussion flaking, the pressure flaking used to, get that little serrated edge. While she's sitting there having her lunch, she looks down and she sees all this dimpling, and the stone's probably about, it's a little over 10 feet, I think, by about 5 feet. We get the all dimensions and everything. And she sat there looking at that. Then she got off it, looked back, and she could see a propping stone, just another one of these glacial field stones, if you will, propping it up. So somebody actually worked a fissure, and we found out later they actually worked a fissure or crack in the bedrock. The bedrock is foliated; it comes up in layers like an onion. They raised it, they propped it, and then they started shaping it using hammerstones. In our state archaeologist, Dr. Gary Hume, at the time, in 1980, he joined us, and he was mainstream. He was kind of reluctant to get involved with this attraction called Mystery Hill at the time. Their kind of archaeology is colonial, post-colonial, pre-colonial, is usually points, pottery, that kind of thing, but not structures, if you will. It might be
Yeah.
where a wigwam once sat, perhaps a burial or a workshop where they're making tools, but they weren't into all these stone walls, all this stuff. But he was a lithic specialist. He knew how stone tools were shaped, with those techniques I just mentioned. And he looked at this slab when in '83, when they did an excavation, he was there overseeing it with Dr. David Stewart Smith. The two of them worked together with a couple of assistants. And he says, unmistakable that this stone was actually being shaped like a 10 and a half arrowhead in a Stone Age technology, not Metal Age. This big slab probably was intended to be a roof slab. If you've been in the Oracle chamber and some of the other chambers, you looked overhead, so those very, very huge. This is the kind of stone that was. Since '82, we have found 34 of these stones, and they're propped up all over the 110 acres. And we found a lot of them since I retired. My son found some about 10 years ago while he was doing some work up there. He found a couple more, and it kind of got us excited to keep looking. And we have 34 of them. We're going to GPS them soon, so we have them all on GPS. It looks like you had a much bigger project for building the site, and we think their intention was to bring them up to the main site and do more construction, probably roof slabs, wall slabs, that kind of thing. And then the question came up quite recently, actually, is if they had a big project, why did they stop? Why this work in progress? So that's one of the things that's located over the hill, the Serpentine Walls. There are 15 of them. One of them is 2,550 feet long. It's twice as long as the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio. Wow. And it looks like it's biting its tail. I think I sent you a LiDAR picture where the tail comes in front of the boulder head. That's an amazing chamber. It's called the Watch House. And on your visit, you might remember that's like the first structure you would see on the way up to the site. It's we just did a DNA out of not a DNA. We did some DNA on a piece of bone that came from the main site, but we did a carbon dating too on some bones that came out of the site just recently. So we're using LiDAR. We're using ground penetration radar. We're using OSL, and we just used DNA for the first time on some bones that were found back in 1937 on the main site. They were human, and we got the results back last year, and that was kind of exciting. They were actually Greek bones. We didn't know what to expect, but they were actually measured against 39,500 different samples, and they were Greek ancestry. The Patty family that was up there, you might recall, during the colonial, post-colonial times, they were shoemakers. They were from England. I don't know if anybody in the family had, maybe they married somebody that had pure, but the question is the bones, 3 of them, and they were from, the DNA showed they were related, found in the plaza area, and the soil area is pretty much non-existent. Even in the 1930s or 1920s, when the first photographs of that particular area was taken, there was some debris, some brush, there was some rubble, but you can see the bedrock. Who's going to leave a body up there? And it turns out that the body died somewhere between 1690 AD and about 1900, with 1850 being the medium stuff. So we're using the latest technologies we can, but that DNA just raised more questions, and the carbon dating is like, who was left up there to die on the main site? The Patty family are there for generations, Who would why would that person be there? And you could say, well, maybe an animal brought the bone up, but the bones were from 3 different parts of the body, So it wasn't like just one bone, an animal dragged up from some graveyard down the road a mile away, which would be kind of funny anyway, kind of strange, I think. So the other thing we found is, we have windows. And the spirit windows today, we're started finding those in 2016. And these windows are in the stone walls. And they have a lintel on top, and they'll have like a silk plate on the bottom. And they're maybe a foot and a half wide by maybe a foot tall, and they're all over the hill and the various walls, and they were never discovered until the first one found in 2016. And again, I happened to be there doing some work. I looked, I said, this looks like a window. Some of the windows are together. There's 2 different groups with 4 windows together, and then the other ones are kind of by themselves. More than half are with serpent walls. The other couple are not in serpent walls. That was another thing I saw in Mark Starr's book in 2016 as I'm flipping through, because I had just found my first couple what I called spirit holes or whatever, and I'm looking through his book, and that was one of the categories, these windows. In England, they call them soul holes. I believe they're spiritual, that the soul can go through it. One of them has a stone shutter that actually will fit right inside of it. It's standing right next to it. Another one still has its shutters, actually like Venetian blinds, are all loose inside of it. And there are 4 that have stone cobbles inside, and that made it kind of hard to see them, because if you can't see the light through them, you think it's just a stone wall,
Yeah.
And again, these are all over the 110 acres. They're on Martha's Vineyard, as I found out later from a book written in 1989 called Manitou. I'd read it back then. I read it more recently, and once I found a couple windows, I just read it recently. Like, oh my gosh, I didn't even, there's chambers on Martha's Vineyard near Gayhead. There's walls and other things, but one of the walls has what they referred to as wind windows back in 1989. And so some people were on these things going back even to the 80s, but now we're kind of like, there's a big realization that these things actually exist. And that's another thing we're going to try to do, is try to GPS all 28 of them. And again, they're all over the hilltop. They're
now,
not just looking.
I'm aware of a few theories as to who created the region. But is there anything where it's a really good guess or something conclusive as to, some kind of definitive, this was made by even if it's a section of it, because it's probably gone through generations of different people who've come across it and maybe even added some of their own bit to it. But is
I
there
think you hit
anything like
the
that?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. We've been thinking that the site's generational. There seems to be some modifications to the site that we even detected in the 1970s with the astronomical center of the site. Today, there are two cairns that are missing, and that's where all the alignments kind of come to. But there's a boulder to the west, and back in the 70s, we actually thought that may have been the original astronomical center. And also, a couple of the serpent walls seem to have been modified. The one by the watch house I mentioned, it looks like it's been modified. You'd actually have to be there to kind of explain what we mean, but it looks like it's been repurposed, and it was a smaller serpent at one time, and then it was made into a 2,550-foot serpent. But a professor from Penn State, Dr. Winkler, a professor of archaeoastronomy from 64, he was retiring in the late 90s. He joined us in 97. And he worked on some of the star alignments that were detected by the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics back in 1978. We had surveyed the alignments from 73 to 1977 with professional surveyor Beverly Pearson and Associates of Derry, New Hampshire. And we paid them kind of as they could go. So it took 5 years of raising money and paying them to come and surveyed about 15 acres of where the astronomical alignments are. We sent that data to Harvard Smithsonian. They said, well, the alignments would work about 1800 BC, plus or minus 250 years due to the Earth's tilt. The obliquity change is a 41,000-year cycle. So it was kind of cool because it actually was the same date as our oldest date, 1800 BC, we found by radiocarbon dating in 1971. And then we had two 3,000-year-old dates too, and then we had another date close to that. So that kind of verified the radiocarbon dating from 7 years earlier. But Dr. Winkler was one thing they mentioned to us we didn't know. They said, you have 24 star alignments here, and we had not detected those by 1978. So Dr. Winkler started working on those 20 years later, and he found that some of the alignments, he actually identified the various star alignments, which is pretty cool, but he died in 2001 from a massive heart attack, which was very sad. But he put out a 30-page paper in 1997, and he kept updating it until his sudden death, so that kind of left that not really complete. So we needed another archaeoastronomer really to continue out this work. So he came up with 3 different time periods that the site may have been built and occupied, starting about 1800 BC. I think it goes for like 1100 years. And then he has another time period from that time until around, I'm trying to remember now, I think it was around, about 500, I think, AD. And then there was a third stage from about 500 AD until about the contact period around 1600. And he kind of describes that. He bases that on astronomical alignments, the radiocarbon datings, and some other data that we have. So he thought maybe the site was built in at least 3 stages. And naturally, Native Americans have been in New Hampshire, would be the first thought. They go back 13,000 years. In Keene, there's a site that the New Hampshire Archaeological Society has worked on, and it goes back that early in time. And, the glaciers were still receding, so it must have been a pretty harsh environment. Up near Jefferson, up near Santa's Village area, they have a paleo site, a little bit younger, about 10 to 12,000 years. Our archaeologist that was with us from 89 up to about 2 years ago when she retired was a president of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society. What a great resource she has been. And she's on the front cover of my new book that just came out. But she had to retire because she's in her 80s. And then she decided to move to Florida near her daughter, So she was up about 2 months ago visiting, but she really can't carry out the work. She stuck her neck out back in 89 to join us, actually, And she mapped a lot of the hilltop using shovel test pits. Looking for archaeological data, geological data, and her husband was a doctor of geology at Tufts University. But her good friend was Dr. Gary Hume, the one I mentioned a little bit earlier. Same name, everybody thinks they're married, they're both archaeologists, great friends, they live near each other, but her husband was not Dr. James Hume from Tufts University. He was really good about the geology. So her thought after doing a shovel test pit study across the hilltop in the 1990s was that the hilltop was pretty bare 4,000 years ago. And over the years, of course, that, as I mentioned, the soil very slowly comes in from vegetation decay and wind-blown particles, settling on the ground. And again, about 125 years for an inch of soil. In some areas of the hilltop is still bare bedrock. All the walls, all the chambers that we've ever check both archaeologically and with ground penetration radar, which we've been using since the 1990s. The walls all sit on bedrock. That was a service that these people saw when they came here to build the site. And then over time, the soil slowly builds up around the walls, chambers, on top of the roofs, and so forth, which is great because we can actually do OSL dating with that, that leaves behind kind of a thing to date, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. Now, I got a couple questions. I'm going to put them into one question. They're all the same subject matter. In the 70s, Hans Holzer had visited the area. What was he looking for there? Was he looking for anything paranormal, any kind of ghosts, any spirits? Has there been any kind of paranormal activity at the site? And if so, also, have you guys used like maybe an EMF reader or anything like that to take readings of the stones and of the area itself? And if so, what did you find?
Yes to that, for sure. Yeah, Hans Holz's first visit was about 1970, and he came back many years in 71, 72. And actually, the cool thing is he used a camera. He had like a Super 8, Kodak or whatever it was. He also recorded everything on a voice recorder. By 1974, he brought in that year Ethel Myers, a psychic, and she came in around, I think, November 12th, I think was 74. Before that, another Nancy Abel came in that year, like on July 12th, I think. And then there was a third psychic. Trying to think of her name right now. It's on the tip of my tongue. But he brought in 3 different psychics. And those readings from that are actually in a book he wrote in 1992 called Long Before Columbus. And it was all about our site. So that book came out 32 years ago. And he was looking for anything to do with spiritual, ghost, any kind of paranormal activity. He came from Austria. I guess he got his PhD in psychology, I think it was. And he became kind of like the father paranormal, kind of, living in New York City. In 1976, he actually was up again, and he actually did Leonard Nimoy's episode on us on In Search Of. We were number 2, I think, of the 144 episodes that Leonard Nimoy did. And so you can actually, I think, YouTube all of this, The other thing that happened more recently in 2020, I apologize, a little sore throat there from the allergies. They did a show. He died in 2009, the same year my dad passed away, and they kind of stayed in touch over the years. But the Holzer Files came out on Travel Channel, so Discovery Network actually controls all of that, and they sent the team up, and they spent a whole week at our place. We were all notified months in advance, and they came up with a whole team of probably a dozen people from California, the makeup artist from Virginia, David Schrader. David Schrader, he's a host, and I've been on his radio show going back almost 10 years ago, but he came up and got to meet him finally. He spent the whole week there with us. And he even brought in Scott Walters. They both live in Minneapolis, so Scott was flown in too to do a little cameo on that, or just a little bit on that. He was in for 3 days actually, so got to spend time with him too. So the Holzer Files, the second season, and the episode was called Ancient Evil. And his daughter, Alexandra, actually, I met her for the very first time. In the 70s, she was a young child, but she actually came up from New York City. I actually mentioned to the 3 producers, actually, they had 3 producers on the show, and I said, it'd be kind of cool to bring her up. She lives in New York, I met her dad many times, I never met her. And so, to my surprise, in the middle of the week, they came in they came in around the weekend, and by Wednesday, they'd work all night, but I'd leave at 10 in the evening so I could be up in the morning to open the business up, And as I was leaving, I was saying bye to everybody, and this woman walked in, and she goes, "Hi, I'm Alexandra Hostess." So it kind of blew my mind. I'm like, oh my God, gave her a hug and everything. But I said, I knew your dad for years and years and years, and she had never been to our site. So Long Before Columbus is one source, that book. It's probably, you probably can get it on Amazon or one of those, something like that. 1992, it came out on Columbus's 500-year anniversary. And it really gets into the different psychics, what their experience was. And it goes chapter by chapter, plus Hans' own, his own feelings about the site and everything. So that book is pretty cool. And then the Holzer Files, you can get on there and you can see the whole thing about what Hans did 4 years ago what the production company did. And actually, Alexandra used her dad's camera in the Oracle chamber, and she got it looks like a profile of a person in the entrance. It's all black. It looked just like a profile. It was kind of freaky. on Friday night, they revealed everything to me, that and some audio stuff too. That was kind of cool. That's the way they run the show, They
Yeah,
do an
yeah.
interview on Monday, and then Friday they sit you down inside of our big theater. They all set it up like a studio, about 10 o'clock at night or whatever. And then they started showing me the stuff and get your reaction. So it was kind of cool, But we do have paranormal stuff going on there for decades. Probably starting, I think the first one's coming up. We have a stargazing UFO thing coming up October 4th. It'll be in our brand new area. We're going to do stargazing in the future. We'll talk about the stars, the constellations, that kind of thing. So we're going to start doing that. But October 4th, we have Mike Stevens. He's a New England paranormal guy, fairly well known. He's going to be doing an event with us on that evening. It's on our website. So I'm kind of excited for that kind of thing.
Anything that stands out in particular as far as the paranormal or anything unknown that occurred?
Hans, his daughter got that image, and then what they got for recordings. But there's been other different, Jeff Belanger. I don't know if you're familiar with Jeff. He writes for Ghost Adventures, and he's a big New England paranormal guy. He has his own podcast. He's done a couple of events up there. I'm just hearing children's voices. I've heard it myself up there. About a year ago, I was walking up with my dog. I heard from my yard, we go uphill to the summer solstice sunset. I'm going kind of southeast. And I heard these kids up on the hill. They sounded like very young kids. And this is after hours. Nobody's supposed to be up there. It's all closed off, secure. Mm-hmm. I'm like, oh, great. We're going to have this tonight. We're going to have kids trespassing, goofing around up there. My dog didn't seem to react. I thought she's usually very sensitive. She hears something, she barks, she's very attentive. So I got up top of the hill. I'm walking up closer and closer to the summer solstice monolith. I can see it, and the hill's still going up. I can still hear the voices. I get up on top, and I'm expecting to see a bunch of kids, screwing around, jumping on stuff, whatever, and gonna make me kind of mad, like you're trespassing, you're not supposed to be here, that kind of thing. I start looking around. And I heard, just as I came on top, I heard a couple more voices, and then I get on top, and it was like quiet. I'm looking around, okay, where are those little kids, I'm looking all around. I have a pretty good sight all the way to the site, about 600 or 700 feet away. I can see that very clearly. The only thought I had at that point, maybe they got in some of the chambers, like the Oracle chamber, they ran in there or something like that to hide or something. But I got up to the main site. I got on the astronomical platform. I got into the chamber. I'm like, where the heck are these kids? But other psychics, there's a Lynn and Willie that do paranormal in New England too. They're pretty well known. We've been on the USS Salem doing things. I've been with them on that. They've had the same kind of experience with children up there. There was not a kid around. My dog never reacted again. And I'm looking you can see for hundreds and hundreds of feet. Was I hearing an echo from, there's a couple lakes around? I don't think so. But these kids sounded like just over the hill, just out of my eyesight. And as I came up, there they would be, and I'd, have to scoot them out of there, So that was I think one of my weirdest things. There have been UFOs found in the area too. Seen actually a cube. One of the girl with her mom was actually coming up about 3 years ago, and she actually videotaped it right over our site. And from my Palladium window, we look west and right on the summer solstice alignment, if you were looking towards the west below Manchester Airport, where I learned to fly back in '74. And I'm looking at a very, very bright light, 9 o'clock on a mid-February night, pure. It was just, clear skies. And I said, oh, it must be a landing light. It looked a little strange. It did not look correct to be landing on runway 6 in Manchester or runway 35. I didn't see any strobes. I didn't see any rotating beacon. I didn't see any logo lights from an airline. Like on our planes, you'd have the tail lit up. But the headlights are so bright, sometimes you can't quite see that until you really stare at it to see the other lights because it's so darn bright, All of a sudden, that light, it was very intense. It just went straight to the ground. So I saw it for about 3 seconds, and then it went straight to the ground instantaneously. Kind of looked like the video you might see over Dome in the Rocks over in Israel, where the UFO goes straight up. It was it was just like that, as quick as that.
It was like that. That's a crazy one.
Yeah, right. And there's no real bodies of water there. Londonderry, part of Derry area, south of Manchester. I did mention this to Kathleen Martin. I don't know if you know Kathleen. She's the niece
she's been on the show too.
Betty. Oh, that's terrific. Yeah, she's been to our site. She came in the '70s, and I mentioned that to her, and she goes, "The only thing I can tell you is it's either like Skinwalker Ranch or it's like a reptilian, But her aunt, of course, is Betty Hill, and Betty Hill came in '74. And I meant to mention when Ethel Myers came up November 12th, Betty somehow heard about it, probably in the newspapers. She actually came over to get a reading by Ethel Myers. I have asked Alexandra Holzer if she can dig through her dad's files to see if they ever did that, because I was there, but I can't really remember if she went into we had like an office space where it could be quiet. They could have gone in there and done like a psychic reading. But I said, Alexander, if you can ever found it, that would be priceless to have Betty Hill, being interviewed or being, the psychic with Ethel Myers, doing a reading on her. But Betty became a friend of my mom's. I think Betty died about 21 years ago, but they were friends right up to the end, my mom and Betty, We never met Bonnie. He died in 1969. So we're kind of always interested in UFOs. And Travis Walton's been to our site. The 1975 White Mountains. Yeah, he's been to the site. I gave him a little VIP tour. I met him twice. And afterwards he sent me this really nice little package with an audio with his book and a really nice little thing. He signed his book with a nice little thing below it, keep on exploration or keep on whatever. It was kind of a cool little thing. He's a very nice guy. Very. And Calvin Parker. Too.
I was going to say a bit of a side question for you. You were a commercial airline pilot. Did you see any UFOs during your time as a pilot?
Yeah, nothing what we call close encounter, You would see things off in a distance. I did fly for a regional airline in the 80s for 6 years, and then I got on with UPS flying out of Louisville. I was flying on 727. It's all pretty much night flying. Occasionally we did some daytime, and we'd look up and see this bright object in the sky and go, what the heck is that? You fly for months and months at night. You look like a werewolf, and then you'd fly a day trip for the company. And you're like, what the hell is that? It was the sun, we hadn't seen it for weeks, But anyway, but I flew with a lot of Vietnam pilots too, and they told me about things over in Vietnam, some Korean War people. But by the 80s, the World War II, my uncle was a World War II pilot, flying B-29s, B-17s actually in the war, and B-29s later, and then some fighter planes. And he actually was instrumental in the archaeoastronomy at the Hill. He actually was very instrumental with that when he moved back from California around 1961, I think it was. He working at Point Mugu on rocket sled test, VOR navigation, which I used, and today GPS has taken that over. But after the war, he did a lot of cool stuff. He worked for Raytheon, he worked for Sandus, but my dad put him to work at our museum working on the astronomy, and I don't know if he ever saw any Foo Fighters. He did get shot down in Belgium in his B-17, and the Belgian farmers came out and almost pitchforked them to death because they thought they were the Germans and were American. But anyway, he made it out of there alive, So that was part of, and he was a friend of Alan Shepard, the first astronaut too, at the high school together. So I always was in aviation. That was my thing. And I saw really nothing that close, but my stuff was always on the ground. I had coming through where Betty Hill lived in Kingston, New Hampshire. That's where she grew up, but she was living her adult life in Portsmouth. But going through an intersection of 125 and Route 111, you might know where that is in Kingston, and it was a green light. We're heading west. And my wife isn't really big in UFOs, but we both looked to the right, to the north as we went through the intersection. Something caught my eye. You should be looking forward as you drive, right? And my eyes went to the right through the intersection. I wish it was red. I would have stopped. We could have actually focused on it. It was the darndest thing, and I still to this day, I can't really describe it, but I was thinking, it's a KC-135 from Pease, an aerial tanker refueler, although they now have the 767s over there. But my wife got a better look at it. She goes, it was very angular. It was looked like it was pitched nose down, and it was probably about 300 feet above the ground, and it was very large, and it wasn't the the Air National Guard, the gray colors they paint the planes, Mm-hmm. This was like a darker color, but very angular. And the thing is, if it was an aircraft, it would have hit the ground in about 3 seconds, from all my experience. I flew for about 30,000 hours in my career, so quite a bit of time. But I've never seen anything like that. That was my second one. And then there was another one we saw back in the 60s, coming back from one of our researchers' summer home up above Concord, New Hampshire. And as you're driving back through Manchester, New Hampshire on the west side, the east side highway didn't exist at that time. And we saw a bright light over the city, and we kind of run the 293, it's called today, I think, but the Everett Turnpike actually goes around in kind of sort of a little bit of a circle, and you could actually see the background stars kind of shifting with relation to this very bright light. The light, by the way, looked like the one I saw 3 years ago, extremely intense. The next day on WFEA Manchester AM station and some other, my mom was listening to that. They were talking all about it. So it wasn't just us. There were people in Manchester that saw the same thing. It was very, very unusual, but it didn't move. I don't know when
Mm.
it did move, but the whole time we watched it, because one of my friends in the back seat with me was his dad was an air route traffic controller at Boston Center. He was a supervisor over there, and this is back in about 66. And when my dad and he would get together with a few beers, their lips would loosen up, and he would actually talk about things that he saw on his radar that he could not explain. When he wasn't in that kind of loose lip, he wouldn't say too much about it. He kept, he didn't talk much about UFOs. But when you look at primary versus secondary radar, secondary is transponders on a plane, but primary, you can see birds, you can see trees moving. They can adjust their computer so they don't see trees and all of that stuff, or birds. But you can tune it so you can actually see all that. At least back in the 60s, you could. And so you could see an object up there that doesn't have a transponder. And that's what they're watching. He said it was very, very unusual. It was extremely fast. Couldn't explain it. Other controllers with different, screens saw the same thing, maybe other centers, like Boston Approach, for Logan, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that was just an interesting take, and we heard stories about UFOs from him, and he was one of the supervisors over at Boston Center, which is in Nashville, New Hampshire, one of the 21 centers across the nation that control en route traffic, So, yeah, we have a lot of unusual things at our site, but meeting Betty Hill and all of those people was pretty cool, So, but.
Yeah.
We'll get into our paranormal stuff coming up. Yeah, we have a website. We'll stop posting some of the things coming up, and so it gets kind of exciting in October.
All right, very interesting, man. Okay, so you sent me some pictures here. Let's go over what we're seeing. So I'm gonna share the screen, and on this image here, what are we looking at?
Yeah, that's called the sacrificial table. It's between the two monoliths. And because those stones are pretty cool, the big monoliths like that, you find those in European sites. You also find those for some of our astronomical alignments. But the table is about 9 feet long, about 6 feet wide. It has a large groove. And in 2016, the year that Dave Stewart Smith died, he was doing a video, and he mentioned the size of the groove. In between, I was there while he was talking on camera. And when the camera stopped, I said, Dave, how would you measure that groove? In the center of the groove, to center of groove? Because he mentioned 4x6. He goes, yeah. So the next day I went up and measured it. Actually, it turns out that the bottom of the groove from side to side is 9 inches wider than the top. It's actually a trapezoid. And that's important because we started doing LiDAR in 2020, and we started looking at some of the chambers using the LiDAR. This LiDAR was handheld. You can see down to 1 centimeter, high resolution. It's a $50,000 unit. And the guy name is Tom Elmore. And he comes up from Connecticut, and he's been doing sites all over the Northeast. And actually in Belize, he's doing a couple projects too, down on some Mayan ruins too. He's a landscape architect with a master's degree, got into this work about 5 years ago. He's been doing his profession for decades. So he came up and started doing 15 acres of the site. It took 600 hours to process the data. We started looking at the chambers because he actually got into the chambers and actually got the dimensions. Those structures, like the chamber in ruins, the plaza, not the plaza area, the area where the patty house once sat, we think it was a courtyard, the patty chamber, and then there's a little vestibule. You can't quite see it on the bottom left-hand part of this picture is where the vestibule starts. They're all trapezoid in shape. They're not 90-degree corners. They're actually a trapezoid shape, just like the groove on the table. To the left of the table and those two upright stones is the oracle chamber. You can just see the grass from the roof. That chamber is a little over 27 feet in length. It runs north and south. And it has an east wing that goes about almost 20 feet. I guess it's about 18 feet to the east. If you took the roof off the entire structure, it would look like the letter Y. So Mr. Goodwin back in the 1930s called it the Y cabin. It has 5 closets, stone closets. It has 1 window. And actually it has an exit window too. So actually 2 windows in that chamber. It has 2 carvings. It has a chimney that had 2 stone louvers in it. And in the second year we were open in 1959, I believe, somebody took the 2 stone louvers, and we have photographs of them. They actually stole them, or they borrowed them,
wow.
Let's say. They borrowed them like 65 years ago. We never saw them since, which is really sad. Somebody would actually take those. They could be used to adjust a draft. And Mr. Goodwin tried it in the 1930s. He lit a fire in there, and it actually drafted and warmed up the structure. We don't think it's a living site. We think it's a ceremonial site. But that chamber does have a bed that's about 8 feet long, and it has its own little window in it that looks inside the chamber. And so somebody could spend time in there during maybe a solstice, like a priest, a shaman, and use that for their, where they actually stayed, temporarily, I think.
Now, what about this? What about this makes it a sacrificial table?
Yeah, we don't really know. That name was coined a long time ago. It is set up on 4 legs, and when Mr. Goodwin came in 1936 and saw the site for the very first time, and Malcolm Pearson, his right-hand man, was a photographer, so Malcolm started clicking away immediately, and he made glass slides, plastic slides later, and also we still have a lot of undeveloped negatives, but he made a lot of prints too. The table was buried up to the bottom of it, and their impression was, and I'm sure my aunt and uncle probably thought the same thing. They unfortunately have been gone for decades, but that the table was resting on dirt. It was just sitting on dirt. And as they excavated it in 1938, they actually excavated around the table. The second year they were there, the second year Goodwin owned the property, they found 4 legs underneath supporting the table. So it was actually a table with 4 legs under it. One of the legs was kind of damaged, so he repaired it. But it could be a table that was used for many different purposes. People call it a slaughter table, a lye stone for making soap, a cider press, a sacrificial altar, a ceremonial altar, a birthing table, perhaps an embalming table. So you name it. But it has that
there
big
is a groove for the liquid.
Yeah, exactly.
But that could be for so many things other than... Because I don't get human sacrifice out of this site.
Right. Yeah.
The energy, I think, would feel different. Have they done any kind of paranormal readings to kind of find something?
That's a good point. I think we need more of that there. And I assume that Hans did back in the 70s, ask questions. Oh, it's in his book. And I just read his book a year ago before I finished up my book. So some of the details, I'm starting to forget now. It's been a year. But I have his book actually up in my room. But I think he gets into some of that with the 3 different psychics that year, giving readings of who these people could be, what did they look like, how tall they were, what was the purpose of them being here. And all 3, some of the things overlapped and some were a little bit different between, the different psychics, so that book's available for, you can get that book and actually see what he says with those 3 psychics. But yeah, I don't get any really negative vibes. I don't know what that's worth, but it could be animal, possibly sacrifice. That little vestibule I mentioned has 2 little niches, almost like somebody kept food in there or something like that. It's just the strangest little area with detail to it. So somebody spent time really building that. And it is, again, trapezoid floor plan to it. Some of the megalithic sites in England, I've been there several times because I should have brought a tape measure, but they were reported to be trapezoid in shape too, just to throw that out there. So, but it's also in Mexico. We've seen trapezoid. I haven't been to Peru yet, but if you look at some of the Inca ruins, you'll see doorways and windows. So ancient people did sometimes like the trapezoid,
I was going to say, when you were mentioning serpent walls before, it reminds me a lot of that region, which is strange to think about. That region that's thousands of miles away,
right?
But even the way that the structure is kind of built, it kind of reminds me of that kind of Incan stone structure.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, it really does. It has that feel to it. Actually, Tom Elmore, the light-eyed gentleman, and the gentleman from Minnesota is coming back out, and they're going to be going to Belize again, but they're going to come out, and they're actually going to be bringing up 2 people from Peru. And one was the former director of cultural history in Peru, and that will be October 24th, I think. So it'll be kind of exciting. We're going to have somebody from Peru involved with the history of Peru and see what he feels. It'll be kind of
nice.
What his. It'll be kind of cool.
Yeah, that would be great.
That'd be kind of neat. Yeah. I think the site ceremony, when you look at all these structures, including that one right there, it does not look like a farm. I lived on a farm up in Vermont in my first flying job for the first 3 years in North Clarendon, where the Rutland Airport is, and I used to.
This is a very purposeful kind of special area, not just a run-of-the-mill. Let's create some kind of structure for farming or storage.
And usually farmers, they built their wooden superstructures over stone foundations, and they're usually rectangular, square. They're not trapezoid in shape, and they don't look like this with stone roofs and all. But that we call a V hut. It actually faces southwest. It's the only chamber on the site not facing north, south, east, and west. It's actually southwest, kind of towards the winter solstice sunset. I have seen structures like this in Ireland when I visited Ireland. They call them wedge tombs. And the thing that was interesting is not only the size and the shape, but also the orientation in Ireland. They're always facing southwest in Ireland. Some of them have a little flat back wall. This one actually goes to like a point in the back. But I did see a couple in Ireland that look like that with a point in the back, not a flat back wall. So in Ireland, they call them wedge tombs because a little bit more of a wedge shape. But they have, on this one on the front right, you see a slab on its side. You'll see that in Ireland too, like County Meath, Ireland. You see a picture of one of these, and when we visited too, there's little stones on the right side. The thought is, and I don't know if this is still accepted, that they may have been used to block up the structure, and they were used as tombs because they call them tombs over there. They call them wedge tombs. They think they were used for burial purposes. And in Spain, they have the same kind of structures. On the top right, you can see a little white paint on the edge of that slab. It's like a little notch. It looks very small and insignificant in the picture, but it's a little bit bigger. The one in Spain was the same spot, but it was a bigger notch because we find these notches on these slabs. I mean, almost all the slabs except for the sacrificial table have these little notches. We don't know what the purpose was. What you can't see in the front left of that picture towards you, if you will, is a basin cut in, and it's partly natural and partly cut out, and it actually runs towards that wooden structure, and it goes into an underground drain, and the drain runs about 40 feet. We have about 9 of these underground drains running up to 75 feet. Whoever built the site engineered a whole system of underground drains, and the purpose we think is for when there are snow melts or when it rains. They still work today, and before the underground part, there's usually a channel carved into the bedrock directing the water into the underground drain. Generally, not every one of them have that. So a whole complete network. But the one in Spain had that little notch, as I mentioned, on the right side of that slab, and in front of it, it had the same basin. It was about maybe 1/3 the size of our basin, but the notch was about 3 times the size as ours. But they're in the same place, and they also had the stones in the front of the structure. I believe in the one in Spain was off to the right also. Sometimes the stones were off to the left because, again, they think they used as burials, and maybe they put a body in there. They would seal it up, and sometimes they would let the flesh come off the bones, depending on the tradition of these people, and then they would remove the bones for the next burial.
Has any of the ground penetrating radar, has that found anything?
Actually, we have used it up there. We have found a couple of interesting features to us. The bottom of a chamber that fell down during a hurricane, not the 38 hurricane that's so famous in New England, but it was one 10 years later. And our first manager in 1958, his daughter played in it in the 1940s. In 1939, I believe it was either the Boston Globe or the Haverhill Gazette. We actually have it in a book called the Mystery Hill Source Book, written in 1978. But in that book, it talks about that structure. We could climb into it. When you got in there at eye level, you'd be looking back out. Well, that big tree came down in 48 during a hurricane, and it just destroyed the structure. So we put radar over there back in about 30-something years ago, and they said, yeah, go down about 3 or 4 feet, you have a flat, looks like a floor to it. So our intent someday is to actually excavate that. And we were going to do that in 1989 when Pat Hume joined us, but she got involved with the North Stone was starting to tip, and she worked on that project for 3 years. That monolith was going to fall over. So 89, 90, and 91, she worked on that. And she actually found a fire pit. The fire pit was right up against a stone, and it dated to about 750 AD. So somebody was building a fire next to that stone and using it as a backstop. If the stone had been put there by the Patty family 200 years ago or 150 years ago, by digging a hole, you would have dug through the different layers of soil called strata. You would have destroyed that, and you would have put the stone in there. You would have put the dirt back up against the stone, and that fire pit would have been completely destroyed. It would have been just charcoal all over the place. So that wasn't the case. So the stone was there, it was undisturbed, and then somebody about 1,300 years ago built a fire right up against that stone. Then she got on the shovel test pit study, after that, and she worked on that, as I mentioned, to map the entire hilltop, and most of the hill was bare back then. She worked on that for several years too. So the ground penetration radar was used in the early 90s, and she put it in a couple different places that were interesting. More recently, Tom, the gentleman with LiDAR, brought his friend from Waltham, Mass. Her name is Doria, and she has Radar Solutions International. She does ground penetration radar all over the Northeast, and she works for New York City too, stuff in the city. But she has been coming up and helping us with her radar mapping, like the Oracle Chamber roof. She mapped where the core came from the OSL. She also mapped some stuff to the west of the main site, and she wants to come back and map every one of those underground drains because they've never been mapped properly. Be kind of interested to see what's in there. Maybe there's some things that, like, a couple of them have been excavated, and they find stone tools, and they find some modern stuff that gets washed into them, just like at home things go into your sink, into the drain. So she wants to map them. That would be kind of cool. She's just got to find the time. She's straight out. She comes up and she's so, we just love having her up there. She's so nice, and she was going to come this spring, and she kept putting a date. Rain came, and so maybe we can do something this fall with her, if she has a moment or two. She has to come up from near Boston, to do it. So
now, several questions here when I see this, especially for those that might be watching at home. One, is there an estimation to the weight of these stones, especially that stone roof? The second one, what's the scale of this in terms of the ground to the ceiling of that stone roof? And then also, what are these stones made of?
Right. Get the last one first. It's granite. It's made out of mica, feldspar, and quartz. It's called Bastard Granite in New Hampshire, and we are the granite state, so it is also foliated, so it does come up in layers. So these people actually, that big roof slab you see there was actually part of the bedrock, and they were able to work a fissure or a crack, and then they raised it, propped it, and then they began, shaping it somewhat, and then they put it on that chamber. The weight of granite's about 163 pounds per cubic foot. So if you just do the dimensions of that, and you do the 163, you can come up with a weight, of the stone. And the front of that stone, I would guess probably it's probably about 2 feet, maybe 2 feet, maybe 30 inches off the ground. So not too high, And that's the way they are in Ireland too, They're just, up near your, between your knees and maybe your hips, somewhere around that elevation,
Yeah, kind of like enough to sit under or lie under.
Or throw a body into.
Yeah.
if that's what it was used for, that's what the thought. In New England too, the soil is very acidic. Unlike if you go to England, it's very chalky, and bones will. We've been over to England. You go to West Kent at Loughborough, 300-foot. It's a big mound, 300 feet, and then the chamber is about a third of that or a fourth of that. We've been there a few times. It's been 2 decades since I've been there though, and you can still find, they found bones when they opened it up because the soil over there is not as acidic as it is here. The weathering conditions, the water, and also the acid in the soil. And I think a lot of that comes from the granite, and it will decompose the bones within a few hundred years. They do find bones occasionally in New Hampshire Archaeological Society, maybe in peat or clay or some other type of material. But generally speaking, the bones will dissolve. If Mr. Goodwin hadn't cleaned that chamber out, and the one next to it, to the right, there's another tomb, we think. If he hadn't cleaned them out, and we have photographs before he was here, we have photographs from 1900 to 1920, 16 years before he ever visited the site. So people go, what did it look like before Goodwin? Well, we know, and actually the Boston Globe and the Havel Gazette were photographing the site in 1934 and 35. So we have those photographs too from the newspaper. But there was some debris in there, and if they took that out carefully, they might check it for, I think phosphorus is one of them, maybe potassium and calcium, I think. Some of the trace elements would tell you that, it was a human body in there at one time, and unfortunately, Mr. Goodwin got in there in the 1930s technology. They went in there looking for artifacts. So they would take the dirt, they would sift it, they'd look for artifacts.
Yeah.
You could, and that was not really their fault. That was the level of technology at the time, and what we're doing today, maybe 100 years from now, they'll go, those barbarics, what were they doing back in, 2024, it's just because, technology, it gets better and better. The methodology gets better and better, so.
Yeah, the archaeoforensics.
Yeah, So that's what happened. He got in there and really started cleaning and restoring. That chamber is so cool. That's a south-facing chamber. About a couple years ago, people started commenting on it, going, I think you're looking at an animal effigy. You're looking at the side of an animal there. The whole structure kind of looks like an animal. I'm like, I've been coming here since 1955. I don't know I don't know about that, So I went up there one day, 2 summers ago with my pups. We walked up there and it was overcast, so there wasn't too much shadow, which didn't really affect it anyway. But I wanted to get some shots for radio shows, and that's one of the ones I took, as a matter of fact. And that there, I looked at it, and when I think what we think now, what it could be, and this pareidolia, you see a face in clouds, it's not really there, so you got to be careful of that. But I think what we're looking at is a turtle effigy with the head to the left. The flat lintel stone is actually the belly, and over the lintel stone you can see the curvature of what would be the shell. On the very right at the bottom, you can see like the tail, like that little stone on the right there. And the legs would be on either side of the opening, the front legs and back legs. So we don't know for sure, but turtle was a huge thing with Native Americans and some other cultures too. The serpent was too. And it's possible that that was actually designed to look like a turtle, and you can leave it up to everybody's opinion, we don't want to put this in we don't want to tell the ancients what they did. If we could talk to them and ask them, did you actually intended that? So that's kind of cool. I don't know, not everybody sees it. Some people see it immediately, like, oh my God, because I take tours, like VIP tours, and I'll have people stand back and say, do you see any kind of animal shape, any kind of profile? About half of the people go, I see it, and the other people are looking and looking and looking. So kind of individual thing, I guess. But I think it's a turtle, and the turtle is actually facing to the left, and it's kind of just goes out of the frame. The head of it kind of goes out of the frame. It's kind of missing there, but the tail is kind of almost missing too. It's on the bottom right, to the right, the little tail. It looks like a tail, actually, yeah. So it could be, but that faces south, and Goodwin saw similar ones from photographs in Ireland and County Meath again. There's one called a fugu, and the fugus were sweat houses by the ancient, I guess, probably Celt or even the Irish cultic monks, and there were places where monks would go in, supposedly. You build a fire in front of it, they would sweat, they'd come out. Down below this is a swamp, so he thought, well, maybe they ran into the swamp and cooled off after they were in this sweat house with a fire in front of it. We have no idea that that's what that was used for, So our best guess is, it's some sort of a ceremonial chamber, to put offerings in. It's a lot of structure there with very little space. You could probably put 3 or 4 people in there, but you certainly wouldn't live in a structure like that. And it doesn't seem to be one of those burial kind of chambers, at least if you look at the old world type, It just doesn't seem to resemble that. So, but it's facing true south, north, south, east, and west, out of true north. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned about Ireland too, because that's one of the more popular theories as to who created some of this stuff was the Celts.
Yeah, and Goodwin was on that. Initially, when he saw the site, he thought it was the Vikings, but as they began the second year, he saw it in 36, 37, he bought it, and they began the cleaning operation, debris, brush. You see the photographs, it was kind of a mess, and they cleaned up a lot of the brush and debris and everything, and then they started putting stones back. His idea is if a stone was within 3 feet of a structure, you put it back on top, which may not be terrible, possibly, but like Newgrange in Ireland or any Chaco Canyon, which you've been to, if you look at the photographs before and after, there has been an alter, it has been altered a little bit, but he didn't build anything really from scratch. He just put stones back up on top of a pre-existing structure. Some of the damage was done from quarry activity by the Paddy family. They actually had maybe a third of the site removed back probably in the 1850s. Yeah, and that's certainly not unheard of. We've been to Ireland, and some of the structures I saw, like Knowth, Douth, and Newgrange, and I forget if it's Knowth or Douth. Newgrange has been all rebuilt, back in the 60s. It's an amazing structure, and it's illuminated on the winter solstice, but one of them had a crater in it, and I was here with my dad over 40 years ago before I met my wife, and I said, what's that crater in the middle? And this thing's 300 feet across, like Newgrange, Knowth, and Douth are almost 300 feet across. It looked like gigantic flying saucers, just huge. And it's got that big thing. It turns out during the Irish potato famine, they say a third left Ireland, a third stayed behind, and a third died. What they did is they put people to work, and they actually were building roads, and they needed like a foundation for the roads. They actually went up to that 5,000-year-old structure and started tearing it apart, using that for a roadbed, and then they use it, which is a shame. They didn't know at the time. They're trying to survive. They were in a really
Yeah,
bad
yeah.
state, a really terrible state. So heart goes out to the people, but unfortunately, that's what happened. You look
Well,
at the
that's the
chamber, it's like,
thing.
whoa.
Yeah, that's what's happened across the entire world with so many of these type of sites is that things
Yeah,
get torn
yeah,
down, repurposed. It's a miracle
yeah.
that some of this stuff even stays up. It's a miracle that they didn't just repurpose all the bricks in the pyramids.
Yeah, yeah.
You
Well,
know,
the casings are missing on the outside. I think the
yeah,
limestone was taken off, so they were bright. At least on the Giza Plateau, they were all brilliantly white with a gold cap. They think, the gold. Of course, you can imagine where that went, but the limestone was repurposed, as you mentioned. At a much later date. And you go to Avebury in England, and that's one of the biggest megalithic monuments. And I got a friend that lives right by there, Maria Wheatley. She just did a conference in Chaco Canyon. She's going to be up in Vermont. She's going to do an event here on May Day next year, a 2-day event. And her dad was here back 40 something years ago. He was an archaeologist and kind of into dowsing too. She's really into that kind of thing. And she's been on TV and Bacon Fox's show. She's been on other History Channel shows. And I was just talking to her today. She just got back to England. In Avebury, if you go and visit that, you see concrete markers where large monoliths once stood, and there was actually a tradition every so many years. Some bishop or somebody would go up there with a bunch of people, and they would actually, I think they would dig next to the monument, and they'd build a big fire, and then they topple the monument into the fire. It would really heat it up, and then they would pour water or vinegar on it to thermal shock it. They would split it up, and part of it was because they wanted building material, because the town of Avebury, it's a beautiful little town, is consumed by, they consumed the part of the megalithic complex from 5,000 years ago, and this was done several hundred years ago. So you have a history and a prehistory, but it's kind of too bad that they altered the prehistory. Um,
yeah,
but it was also because they wanted to, these things were thought to be pagan, maybe evil, maybe, and they wanted to Christianize. And a couple of the big monoliths, actually, rather than knock them down, they actually carved them into Christian crosses, to Christianize them. So when you walk around Avebury, it's pretty cool. You see concrete markers where stones once stood that are no longer there, used for some sort of construction in the town, and then others shaped like a cross. You're like, wow, So that happens, as you mentioned. So
that's
that's a great
interesting
example. Yeah, yeah.
to take, especially the thought process, if that's true, to take something that was considered evil and then create something allegedly that's supposed to be holy out of it. You'd figure let's just leave that and put that, bury it, and pretend we don't know any more about it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
And
interesting.
they did kind of that too. They would actually build some of the megalithic. There's about 50,000 of them in Western Europe. I think Ireland had about 2,000. Neolithic, the New Stone Age into the Bronze Age. But some of the churches and chapels and so forth, if you go in Europe, you'll go downstairs, you'll see a megalithic in the cellar, the remains of a megalithic room. So they actually Christianized it by putting their, and it's not, usually they were built on hills, not always though, kind of up near the god,
Hmm.
higher in the heaven, but is a beautiful megalithic site. And then the Christians came along, they put a temple on top of it, kind of to suppress the ancient pagan, but not, if you can't beat them, join them, but also just put the structure on top of it. So
Yeah, yeah.
we saw that too over there. Yeah, so they literally put it right on top of an ancient megalithic structure. So it's one layer of a
Interesting.
newer thing on top of an older thing. So, but in New
Yeah.
England, about 800 in the Northeast, 800 of these sites, but there are, as we were mentioning, a lot of them are gone today, which
Let's see now.
stories about. Yeah, there used to be a little no longer hear that kind of thing. So, well, that picture there is so cool. That's a great one. That's a LiDAR. That's a handheld LiDAR. That's just a screenshot or a picture taken off the computer. So the fidelity isn't what the computer has, but I took that off our computer. And what you're looking at is a boulder. It's a glacial erratic. To the left of that boulder, it actually is a little chamber that goes in and it wraps around the backside to the right of the boulder, which is pretty cool. There are about 50 of those in New England. One of them's in Gunjewamp near the Navy base in Groton, Connecticut. Looks very similar to that. But only since 2016, we noticed that I think we're looking at the head of a serpent, which is the boulder. Off to the right, you can just barely make it out. The wall goes to the right, and the wall started undulating up and down. And I think I didn't send that second LiDAR image. It actually shows you the undulation of the body going up and down behind it. It goes to the
okay.
right.
Yeah, no, I don't have that one.
Around the entire main site, about 15 acres, comes back from the left, and you can just barely make out the wall on the left and the left of the frame there. It's actually another hump. You can only see half the hump there. The wall goes down right in front of the structure where you could go into it. And then if you look to the right of the picture, can you see the pointed tail pointing at you? That's the end of the 2,550-foot serpent body. And the tail is kind of right in front of that boulder. And if you look at the boulder, you can almost see like where the shadow is, like two eyes almost. And when you're standing there looking at it during the course of a day, even on a overcast day, you can almost see what looks like a serpent looking at you. So it's a natural boulder. And a lot of the ones all over the Northeast, they use boulders. Sometimes they use stacked heads. But it's possible that this is an Ouroboros. Ouroboros, usually the tail's in the mouth. But if you pull up Ouroboros, you'll find one out of so many photographs that has a tail just to the side of the mouth. An Ouroboros would be like the Egyptians had it, the Greeks had it, but I've seen it in Native American pottery because snakes do bite their tail. I actually saw some photographs of that. And Ouroboros can be, depends on the culture, but it can be the circle of life, wisdom, wholesomeness, and it can have a fertility meaning too. But this serpent would wrap around 15 acres, and the main site's 1 acre is right in the middle of this whole thing. It's possible that this was enclosing the sacred area of the hilltop. This is twice as long as the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio, which is 1,350 feet long. But you can vividly see the tail right in front of what would be the face, and the pointed tail right at you. And then you see the white there to the left of the head. That's actually the chamber. And we found out in 2020 the sunlight will go in there, and there's a quartzite stone in there, that one that's kind of lit up. Actually, I don't know why there's a little bit of extra white on there. It's all granite, but this stone is white. And it's Hans Holzer's book. Barbara Hand Cloud did the forward, and she talks about that stone back in 1992. I think she was here in 91. But anyway, she's talking about that stone. It was really something that drew her attention. She actually made a guess as to what it was, and I forget what she says in the book, something about the Eye of Horus or something. In 1996, we had a souvenir book put out by Joanne Lambert. She was one of our staff. She was also a high school Spanish teacher, and she did a beautiful job in this 1996 book, which we sold for years. And in 2018, we replaced it finally with a new book, an updated book. But she talks about that stone. Well, in 2020, we actually had a forestry project done, and the sunlight went in there for the first time. I had a licensed forester, worked with them very closely. I said, this has to be cleared back to our neighbor's property line so we can let the sunlight go into that chamber. Because I had a friend of Scott Walters up the year before that, in 2019, from Texas, and she travels the word. She's doing tours with Scott right now, but she said, with her Sunseeker app, she used technology. She used her little app. She got in there and goes, I think you're going to see the sun hit this stone on the equinox sunrise sometime around 9-ish in the morning. A year later, almost exactly a year later, we watched it, and the sunlight went in, and it actually, at 8 o'clock in the morning, it actually framed the top of that stone with a shadow and light. And then a half hour later, it looks like a hand pointing with its index finger back at that stone. And what we think it is the sun, the rays, the fertilization, and that's a womb, and that stone is kind of like an egg being fertilized in the spring equinox. 2 years ago, I was up there yapping with a woman after everybody had watched there's 2 other earlier morning sunrises for the equinox, and we had seen those. I came down here at 7:30 for the first time, standing there. Everybody else went out for coffee or whatever, and I was facing her away from the chamber, and as I turned around, I said, we still got 30 minutes before we see this event with that framing of the top. And as I looked into it for the first time, I saw that the bottom of the stone, which is kind of like V-shaped, if you will, and again, it's not in this picture, but the bottom of the stone was perfectly framed by the shadow and light at the bottom at 7:30. And over the next half hour, it went to the top, and the top of the stone was framed. And then 30 minutes later, it looks like a hand with an index finger pointing back right at the tip of the finger, right at that stone there, being possibly fertilized by the sun. The boulder is actually a February 1st cross quarter days. The ancient Celts called it Imbolc or Imbolc. I know Maria will correct me in my pronunciation, but it's around Groundhog's Day or Candlemas. the first hump that you can't see to the right is actually November 1st, and that's Samhain or Samhain. We say Samhain, it's Samhain. It's an ancient Celtic holiday, November 1st, roughly, and we know it as All Saints' Day, the day after Halloween. So it has two solar alignments, but the boulder is actually part of the lunar minor standstill moonrise. Every 18 and a half years, that occurs. The next one will be in 2035. But this year coming up, we have the lunar max alignment. So people at Stonehenge, at Carnac, France, and one of the biggest earthworks in the world, besides Avebury, is in Newark, Ohio, just east of Columbus. And we were there last year. It's the UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's absolutely gigantic, but it's aligned with the moon. And it's aligned with the moon on those 18 and a half year cycles. So people will be here, there, and other places watching this. I think some of the sites further out west also are aligned with that too. So that's a multifunctional chamber, and inside of that, 1958 during excavations, they found a stone pendant with a drill hole, and it looks like the summer solstice sunrise monolith, coincidentally or intentionally, we don't know. But a little bone about 1.5 inches long, right next to it, had a drill hole also. We think there were pendants, maybe they were placed in there as an offering. 2 other bones were found in there at the time. They were sent to the Smithsonian 10 years later in 1968 by a school teacher from New Hampshire, from Timberland, I think school, I guess it was. We have her name anyway. She drove down to the Smithsonian, and a physical anthropologist, Dr. Lucille, I think her name was, she actually examined those bones and the ones I mentioned found on the main site that turned out to be human, and she thought they were human back in 68, but no DNA to prove it. But those other 2 bones found in there, I think these are bison, I think they're buffalo. So she showed them to her male colleague, who was actually more of an expert on animal bones, and he goes, yeah, I believe these are bison. And she goes, yeah, but they're from New Hampshire. And he didn't even flinch. He goes, yeah, well, the woodland bison were in that area at one time. It's kind of cool. We had a past in buffalo, but why were the bones in there? Again, were these offerings of some kind? So 3 bones and the stone pendant were found inside that chamber back 1950, 59, I believe it was.
Wow, very nice. Dennis, can you unplug and then plug your mic back in? You're having a little bit of connection issues.
Yeah, could you hear me could you hear me there?
I'm hearing
I lost you again.
You're sort of cutting in and out, and it sounds a little bit like there's some kind of interference on the line.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I heard you well, and about maybe 20 seconds ago, I'm not hearing anything, I just realized that. Sorry about that.
Yeah, okay. It's sounding a little bit better now. All right, let's see. What's this one here? This is a great picture.
that was a winter solstice sunset. That was taken about 3 years ago, around the 20th or 21st of December, the shortest day of the year, and that's looking southwest. You have to have a back sight and a foresight, so you have to have some sort of markers, either wood or stone or something, like a gun sight, to have an alignment with anything. You can't just have like a stone like that, because you can make anything out of it. But you go back to that wooden platform, and that's where the 2 cairns were that were destroyed by Mr. Goodwin in the late 30s. And we got pictures of him with a winch on a wooden tripod lifting up the stones. He thought they were connected to the oracle chamber. There were 2 cairns, 2 piles of rocks there, and he destroyed both of them, rebuilding part of the ramp, which is near the sacrificial table. He actually took the stones, and because he found they were not hollow, he thought they were beehive chambers and that they were connected to the oracle chamber. And there's actually a drain, one of those underground drains between them. They were never connected to our best knowledge, but by the 1970s, we looked back and said, when they did all the survey work, they said all these lines come to this area. What was here? And then because we went back and looked at Goodwin's book I got it right here, as a matter of fact, 1946 book called The Ruins of Great Ireland, New England, and there's pictures of it. There's a book, right? I could show it somewhere. But it's one of his 4 books he wrote. But anyway, that's 1946. He actually destroyed our alignments, and then 40 years later, we discovered his era, So, but that actually was opened up starting in 65. We began opening up that alignment. The reason was a book by Gerald Hopkins. He's from the Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. He's originally from England, and I believe he was at Boston University too. I'm trying to remember if it was BC or BU, but I think it was BU. And he wrote a book called Stonehenge Decoded, and it became an enormous hit. And CBS decided to do a show called The Mystery of Stonehenge, incorporating some of that book in 65, the same year. And so my dad read it. Many research members that were involved with our site read it, and they said, those stone markers that are out in the middle of the woods might be something aligned with the, sun or moon or something. So this clearing was started by one of our workers. His name is Warren Martell, and he was 17 at the time, and he went out, and there's 800 feet of trees they had to clear to see this. And he started with an axe, and then he ended up borrowing a neighbor's chainsaw, and he actually cleared it. And about 3 years ago or so, I'm still in communication with him. He says, hey, I got pictures from 67 of the sun setting over that. I had no idea. Because our first time officially was 1970, and we came down. My dad, a neighbor of mine, my friend, the same age as I did, we came down from Derry, about 8 miles, came down, met Warren at his parents' house. He had driven up from Newport News, Virginia, in his Bug-Eye 1958 Triumph. I don't know how warm that thing was. It was in the winter. He came home for the holidays anyway. And we met him in his driveway. He had built a wooden snowmobile out of parts, and he broke the trail a half a mile from his folks' house all the way up the top of the hill. Their land abutted our property. And we got up there, and we took beautiful photographs. And I thought that was the first time we had photographed that. But in 67, he went up there by himself, and there were cirrus clouds. And you can see it's not a perfect astronomical alignment sunset, but through the cirrus cloud, you can see the sun setting on the stone. And I put that picture in my book. So it's from 67. That's the very first time. And he was the guy to do that. He actually was a nuclear engineer for a career, and he was putting on the reactors on the Nimitz. And if you follow UFOs, the Tic Tac off San Diego, that's the carrier that he put the reactors on. And it's still out there today. He says every 26 years, they got to refuel it. And he ended up going all over the world, South Africa, all Newfoundland, up in Alaska, ended up in France for quite a while. But at the end of his career, he ended up in Osaka. And as he's ready to go back to Charlotte, North Carolina to retire from his career, Fukushima went off. And Westinghouse put him on a 5-member team to move to Tokyo and work on that whole disaster. So his book ends with the Nimitz and Fukushima. He spends his winters in France. His wife is French. He divorced his 1969 wife, but his kids from that marriage still live near here. But in the summer, he goes up to Maine. He lives on an island up there, and then he heads back to France. So he's got a very nice life. He was just doing a Arctic Circle. He was up in the Arctic Circle, and he's in his, I'd say probably 76 or 7, and he's still out there like a youth, still exploring, doing all these really cool things. And he does come back and visit us, and he's actually given me quartz crystals that came out of the upper well back in 1963 that my dad must have given him. And these are the quartz crystals that were found at the very bottom of the upper well. And we think it was a vein, and that well was really a mine shaft to extract these quartz crystals. And they're all on display now. I actually marked the ones he returned. It was a big cluster of them, and then it was actually bigger than the cluster that we had in there. So we have them all on display. I marked them so we know which ones he brought back to us. So that's kind of cool. But anyway, that's the winter solstice, and there are 57 alignments that we know of today with the sun, moon, and stars at our site. And that's just one of them right there. And that's the very first one we ever watched right there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great shot. And then what's this here?
Well, that's actually off Tom Elmore's LiDAR, and we superimposed, I think, it's a little small on my phone, of course, but we have both the solar and the lunar alignments, and we also have some of the star alignments on that too. Some of the 57 are there. Not all of them go back to that center because a couple of the alignments are actually out of the watch house, the illumination we're counting as alignments too, the spring and fall sunrise. That's not from that center, it's from the watch house, So, so that's 15 acres. That's a LiDAR image. And again, it took 600 hours for Tom to process that data. We have the thumb drive. It's, I forget, a terabyte, whatever the heck it is. But you can actually go down, you can go into space, and you can actually zoom down. And with Doria, he's actually got software now with Doria, with her ground penetration radar, to actually put the imaging together for above and below the ground. So her imaging below the surface and his imaging to the surface. They actually have been doing it. They did that at the Newport Tower in Rhode Island, actually. And they're going to try to do it on our site, too.
Has that kind of helped guide you guys with what to excavate or anything like that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's like, well, her radar can go down up to 100 feet, depending on the soil conditions and everything. Sometimes it's much less than that. I'm going to have her put a radar over the drains. I'm going to have her put a radar over that 1948 chamber again and see what she can see with better technology than we had back in the 1990s. The software is better, the hardware is much better. She also found a couple areas on the site that look kind of interesting. I won't get too much into that. She didn't want to stick her neck too much out, but she goes, I've seen this particular thing before, and they actually detected it with their radar back in the 1990s, and they thought it was like a hollow, either artificial or man-made hollow in the ground, and I thought it was just solid bedrock there. And when I had her with her better equipment, she goes, it's not as big as they might have told you, but I've seen this thing before, and I what I've seen before, she kind of told me what it was. And I won't say too much about that right now, but I want to have her come back and shoot that again with her radar and see if what she comes up this time again, you know.
Like a cavern or a tunnel system?
Yeah, but what it might have been used for, you know. So so next time she comes back, maybe we'll have to have another show with you. And
wow.
You know, so whenever she comes back, I have several projects, including where the serpent's tail crosses the double wall path, because I think, again, generationally, they actually repurposed one of the serpents, which was a much shorter serpent, into this 2,550 foot thing. Without digging, it's not, it's not invasive. You know, you don't have to dig. It's kind of nice. You can actually use this X-ray vision like stuff, you know, with a radar, and then you can say, okay, that's great. I think we want to put in a test pit right here. You don't have to dig the whole area up, you know, leaving it for future generations of archaeologists, which would be good, you know. So, yeah, that's our LiDAR. This is about 15 acres. And, again, Tom spent 600. He had a supercomputer. The software is made in Montreal. The hardware, the device is made in Florida. But the 600 hours to do the data processing on just 15 acres, you know.
Wow.
That's one of the windows right there. Yeah, that's one of the first ones I found, you know. And there's actually two more to the, let me think which way I'm looking now, but there's two more, I think, to the left windows out of the frame, and there's one more to the right. So this is a cluster of 4 windows. And you can see this one actually has a shutter that goes in it. And I don't know if I sent the picture with the shutter in it, too. I was trying to send you a bunch of pictures.
This is the last one I've got.
I apologize. And yeah, the shutter in it's really amazing. Our assistant archaeologist, Tupac, guy named Pete, like you, he's been with us for about 12 years, and he actually went to the University of Boulder. He's a master stone mason. He's a mason also, but he worked under David Stewart Smith too for a long time, and then he worked under Pat Hume too, some of it simultaneous. But he saw a stone standing to the right of that, just standing upright. You can't see it in this frame. It's out of the right side. And he goes, Dennis, he has the eye for this. The guy's great. He's just, you know, he really thinks very deeply, and he's got such a great eye for this. He goes, I think, Dennis, that stone might actually have been stuck into that. It looks like it would fit. About 5 inches of it, though, you couldn't see. It was actually 5 or 6 inches in the dirt, stood up vertically. So I said, you know, normally we don't like to move anything on the site. We try to leave everything as untouched as possible, which is, you know, nature does it. People do it all the time. And even the quarrymen back in the 80s. Well, we try not to disturb things. But I said, okay, for research purposes, we'll take it out, we'll put it back, we'll photograph it where it is, we'll take it out, we'll see if it fits, and then we'll put it back where we got it from. And the thing fit in there perfectly. And I apologize because that picture is it's in my book too, you know, it's really cool. It fits perfectly into that. We found some of the other ones have flat stones in front of them too. It's almost like you could put a shutter in there, and then they could open it up. About almost 5 or 6 inches of dirt built up next to the stone. So that could be several hundred, 500 years or whatever soil built up. So whoever stood it up vertically next to the wall just stood it on its end. And then it looks like the dirt just gathered around it, going up the stone over time, you know. And you can see the whole stone has a different color when you pull it out of the ground, you know.
Wow. Yeah.
So this is called a 4-window wall, and it is part of a serpent wall. The tail is 90 degrees bent, and the head is another one of these triangular, kind of a big stone, you know, a rock, you know, a real big, like almost like a boulder, but not quite that boulder size, I guess. But that is, one of the 28 windows on our site. And one of them that looks exactly like this, that Pete actually found the day that History Channel was filming an episode for us on Ancient Aliens. They were doing one of the Hudson Valley site, Gungy in Connecticut, which is a huge site, not far from North Stonington. And the photographer was up there filming all day, kind of on his own, doing B-roll with drones and with his camera. And as we were escorting him down, Pete looked over and said, hey, about maybe 200 feet from here on another wall, he goes, doesn't that look like one of your windows? And we looked over, and it did. And what it had inside of it was Venetian blind, all little flat stones stacked up inside like a shutter. And if you touched them, we didn't pull them out. We don't want to do that, but we moved them. All of them were loosely just set right inside. The other thing we found is 4 of the windows have stone cobbles. These little stone cobbles that you could hold in your hand are all inside 4 different of these windows, and they're all loose in there. Like, are these offerings? What was the purpose of this, But it makes it hard to see the window, too, because they're in there kind of, you can't see right through the window like this one here. You can see the light through it. Well, we've been walking by that window since we opened the site up in 1958. The visitors would have walked maybe about 75 feet from this and never spotted these. And I had been working in there doing some clearing and didn't spot them initially. And one day I just happened to look over, and all you need is a little vegetation in there, and you don't even see it. In fact, I was standing there looking at that with my son. He goes, "Hey, look to the left. There's 2 more windows." And I'm like, "Oh my God, there is." And there's like ferns in front of them and little, brush. And then on the other side, there's like another one, and that's how it is here. We keep finding things. We had a film gentleman who does movies for Prime and for Showtime from Kansas City. He was out last year with his family, fell in love with the place. He went to do an ancient site documentary around the world. And then he flew in for Scott Walter, did a special at our site back just before the equinox. Scott was up for a couple of days. And this gentleman flew all the way up from Kansas City to interview Scott and his friend Haley, myself. He had already interviewed me. But he was walking around with our general manager before I came over in the morning on a Friday, the day before Scott and everybody else arrived. And they found another window out near the winter solstice stone that we just saw. Just, I think, to the right of that is another window that we've been walking by since we opened that trail up in 1970. We opened that trail up, and we never saw it until just before the equinox this year. So these things just hide in plain sight. And once you see it, it's like, oh my God, how could I not see that? So.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, we got one question here from Comics for Life. Comics for Life, we answered a couple of your other questions during the course of the conversation, but this one we didn't touch upon yet. We got a couple minutes on the show. We already went over quite a bit. Comics for Life says, have you ever visited any of the other Stonehenge structures of other countries, and what are the differences that you pick up if you have? I'd like to know if you in particular have visited Stonehenge.
Yeah, we've been to Stonehenge 4 or 5 times. Actually, my son's been there a couple of times. First went there in the 80s and 90s, and because flying for the airlines, we got flying benefits too, and I got a retirement with American, which is very nice. Americans have been very nice to me as a retired pilot, or they just seem very nice, But we've been to Stonehenge 4 or 5 times. We've been up to Scotland, and Scotland has about hundreds of stone circles, and they have megalithic sites. In Wales too, we've been into Wales. We've been over to Ireland. We've been to Switzerland, but we didn't see any megalithic sites there. But Germany, we just had a couple from folks from Germany, a couple different ones. Germany does have a 100-mile road. It's 160 kilometers. They have 1,000 megalithic sites you can see on this one road. I got to get there. I haven't been there yet. We've been to Malta, and some of the Malta has, they used to have what they call the oldest megalithic ruins in the world. Göbekli Tepe recently went back to almost 12,000 years. So Malta kind of lost that, but it doesn't take away from Malta. The cart tracks, the structures, they're just simply amazing. And my wife kind of fell in love with Malta. Just, it's so cool. But when you see some of the structures going back over 5,000 years, they're just incredible. I want to get back to Malta again. We've been to France. We've been to Spain. Been to Morocco and stuff, and seen megalithic sites. Almost every country. When I went to Spain, though, I was on a field trip with a school, my high school, and we did a lot of partying. The whole thing was a party the whole time we were there. We saw a lot of medieval stuff. We were down in Torremolinos. We went up to Madrid, Seville, we went all over the place. But what we didn't see is megalithic sites. And on the West Coast and in Portugal and some of our researchers have been there. And actually, Scott Walsh just did a 10-day tour. They do tours, too, with people. With my friend Haley, they did like a 10-day tour. It's all inclusive, everything. It's pretty cool. Kind of expensive. I mean, it's normal expensive. It's expensive, but very, very cool. They took them to some medieval stuff and then some megalithic stuff. But they have some of the most amazing megalithic structures in Spain and in Portugal. And some of those look very, very much like, I mentioned a couple in Spain already, looking like our V-hut there. But it looks so much like what we have over here on this side of the ocean. And I've seen a lot of these sites all over New England too. I've seen not 800 of them, but 800 different sites. But I've been to many of these sites starting in the early 60s, actually. And my dad got involved with this in 55, 58, we opened. And then in the 60s, we started We didn't go to Disneyland in California. We went to megalithic sites in New York, Vermont, wherever, Massachusetts. That was our summer vacation. But now I look back, even in Pennsylvania too, that was kind of cool. When you get old, you appreciate that. But when you're a kid, you want to go to Disneyland or whatever, But we did see a lot. These things are up in Canada. Last year, we went to Lonzo Meadow. We saw where the Vikings landed 1,000 years ago. My dad was based up there in the Coast Guard before AT&T, right across in Labrador. And he was there in the early 50s. If he had been aware that Lonzo Meadow existed, they didn't know it until about 1960, 61. He would have gone over it because he was into this, and he was right there, So we finally got up to Newfoundland. I recommend Newfoundland to everybody. It's absolutely a beautiful place. It's 400 miles from where you take the ferry. You drive 400 miles up to Lonzo Meadow. It's a pretty big island, And we'll go up to Prince Edward Island again to see that. I don't know if there's anything up there. We've been there before. But yeah, we've seen a lot of megalithic sites in Europe, and I saw like the V hut looks like a wedge tombs. The east-west chamber looked like the galley graves, or what they call gallery graves. And they're always east and west, 20 to 60 feet in length. I saw the one in Karnak, all those rows of stones, over 3,000, 500 stones stood up. Well, There are chambers there. One of the chambers, we were on bicycles, my wife and I, about 40 years ago. We got at the train station. We went to a B&B and stayed. But we drove our bikes all around that area looking at the megaliths, and it was incredible. But what they don't really show you on TV is some of the stone structures right there in Karnak. And one of them looks like our chamber in ruins with a big roof slab that's fallen in, except theirs was still intact. And as I'm driving my bike, I saw a sign, I think it was in Gaelic and French. I took a little French in high school, but I said, what the hell, I'll go this way. I yelled at my wife. She was ahead of me. I thought was coming back. I didn't see her for 4 or 5 hours back at the hotel, and she was not too happy with me. This is back around 84, and I didn't have a cell phone. She had the Nikon camera, and I couldn't take a picture of it. And I got up there, and I looked at the structure, and it looked just like our chamber in ruins. I'm like, my gosh, it's like ours, but the roof is still on it, What I'd like to do is go back there and measure and see if it's trapezoid shape and look at it again. If you Google Karnak, you can't seem to find that chamber. You can find the east-west, what they call a gallery chamber, and it looks like our east-west chamber, but you can't seem to find that structure. And I'm like, what the heck? Maybe it has a special name. I just can't find it. That was 40 years ago. So we've been to France a few times too, but there are other similarities too, the monoliths, and the core building in our structures, the way the chambers, like the east part of our oracle chamber, actually the ceiling is arched, like Corbel, like they call it. It's like an inverted staircase. We found that the corner of the chamber in ruins, the corner walls, were actually Corbel too. We never knew that until 2016, I think. And Tom got in there with his LiDAR, and on the LiDAR, the imaging it down to a centimeter, you can actually see it very vividly. In another structure called the Patty Chamber, the inside 3 corners of the structure are all Corbel. They actually tilt in. That's an old world technique, used in Ireland and some other sites too. So I got to get back over to Europe and hopefully see some of the chambers. Look for trapezoid. There's a chamber near here called the Plastow. Plastow, New Hampshire is a structure there. And that chamber, we measured it this year. I had that team, that the guys that came in to see Scott, the film crew, and some of his friends, we actually went in. And that chamber is not only Corbel, the whole length of it is a big like a shoebox shape, but not exactly. We found out that it's narrower, I think, at the front than the back. It is trapezoid, and it faces the equinox sunrise. So a lot of these structures are facing north, south, east, west, but sometimes the summer solstice, winter solstice, spring. And I don't think it's all coincidental. I know mainstream would like to say, well, that's just a coincidence, that kind of thing. But when they're right on the money, I don't think that's a coincidence. And in Europe, they accept that as intentional, whether it's Newgrange, Alta Delta aligning with a winter solstice or an equinox, Stonehenge aligning with, the alignments too. Not a coincidence, these things are intentional. We did meet the father in Scotland. We get a chance to meet Dr. Alexander Thom. He's considered the father of archaeoastronomy. And he started working on this in the 30s. He died in 1985. We had supper with him in 82 in his compound. And during the war, World War I, he was working for de Havilland Aircraft doing engineering. He was also at the University of Oxford for 15 years. And when he retired in 61 or 62, they actually named the center, the engineering center, after him. And he was also involved with the university, I think, at Glasgow. But his son, Dr. Archibald Thom, was instrumental too. That was his work. His passion was megalithic sites. And he found the megalithic yard, what is called the megalithic inch, and also the megalithic fathom, all these different measurements, just like we do today with either the imperial system, inches, feet, yards, or metric, or some other measuring system. When you build something, you use a yardstick. The megalithic builders did too. It wasn't like just randomly threw these things up. They actually carefully laid out these structures that he found over decades of work. And at first, people refuted him. So those ancient people weren't that smart. They weren't that careful. They didn't have that need to be that careful. And they, that kind of thing, like alley-oop, they weren't bright enough to do this. And it turns out they were. And some of the stone circles were perfectly circular. Put a foci, put a rope, make a circle, put up your stone monoliths, You have an ellipse, you have two foci, and you make, you have like the ropes or whatever used, and you can make an elliptical shape. And when you have 3 points, they actually found out that some of the circles were egg-shaped, and he actually classifies them type 1, type 2. And actually, what they were doing is using the Pythagorean triangle, equilateral, and isosceles triangle to lay out these great big stone circles. And there's about 600 or 700 in Scotland. So they were laid out mathematically, if you will, but they were also aligned with like the moon. And so they're so far north in latitude in Scotland, that the moon everything's further down, south, if you will. And on the lunar major standstill, moonrise, and it does it to the south, and then months later it comes to the north. And this year's coming up is that year. The ancient people would stand on the north side of the circle watching, and the circle is actually graduated in height to the south. So it goes up, it goes over a flat stone called the recumbent stone. Some people think it was an altar, and then it would go down to the right. And what happens in the evening, the moon will rise, and it actually runs tangent to the stones, runs over the top of them, and then it runs down the other side towards morning over that particular year. So astronomically, they were laid out too. And then the megalithic unit of measure, I already mentioned the megalithic yard. We have found that at our site, and they're starting to find, it's 83 centimeters is the basic unit, 32.64. Spain, the megalithic sites, they're finding 32.68, I believe. It's called Vera, the Spanish Vera, although there's a couple different measurements too, but one of them is 32.68, just slightly bigger than the megalithic yard. But they're finding it on this side of the ocean in Peru. Dr. John Clark from BYU has been working on measurement systems for years. He's an archaeologist, and he's found it in Peru, the 83 centimeter, and as well as one other measuring system too, I guess, or increment. But in Teotihuacan, Mexico, which we've been to, just north of Mexico City, he's found that. And on Poverty Point, I think Watson Break down in Louisiana, we saw Poverty Point this spring. We were down there, we drove all around the country looking at some of these mounds, And for the audience, I think there were 1 million mounds from the Ohio Valley all the way out to the Rio Grande originally. 90% are gone today, But some of them you can visit, and that measurement's there too. And we're finding it in New York on the Hudson, and we're finding it at our site. So it might be another piece of evidence suggesting that old world visitors came over. They may have assimilated with the Native Americans, perhaps. But on that Holzerfile TV show, Black Eagle, Daryl Jameson, part of the Wampanoag in Massachusetts, has a whole. He came in. I've met him a couple times. He's really great. He has 23% Orkney Island blood in his body. The rest of it's Native American. He goes, the Native American didn't build your site. He had an episode when he was up there, I think with Scott Walters several years ago. He actually on the ground, So when he came back to film the second time, he said, I'll only go part way up to the watch house. And they filmed him at night. They made up a whole studio there, halfway up the trail from him. And there he gives, on that particular episode, he explains about his feelings about the site and his ancestors in regards to it. So it's really neat. He was a really cool guy. He thinks he's part of the Sir Henry St. Clair, Sir James Gunn, a relative of 1398 coming over the ocean. He thinks he's related to Sir James Gunn. And that's the Westford Knight, one of the early Templars, from Scotland, the Rosslyn Chapel, Dan Brown's book. Scott Walters really gets into all of that, but we have a full-scale cast of Sir Henry St. Clair. And I looked at my father's genealogy after he died. It was a big, thick book he did about 32 years ago. And I see that my great-grandfather's name is Everett St. Clair Stone. So I did a genealogy thing, and it's related to Sir Henry St. Clair. It's Henry St. Clair Stone in England, and it's related to, we think, to Sir Henry St. Clair. It's part of that same family. It was like, wow, it might be. That's what I got on that anyway. So that's a whole different thing.
Yeah, I told you, it's all in the name. It's meant to be.
I think so, yeah. It's like connection. I wish my dad was alive. I'd say, because he was friends with Nevin St. Clair from Scotland, the Rosslyn Chapel. He exchanged, because he's staying. I don't know if he ever knew. He never mentioned to me, hey, we're related to that. He never said that. And he died in 09, you know. So I don't know. But the genealogy and Ancestry 23 say we're related. So I thought, that's pretty cool, you know. But it's been a wonderful evening talking to you. Yeah, I've had
thanks
a great
so
time.
much, Dennis.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed that so much.
Everybody in the chat, thank you guys so much as well. If you stuck with us the whole time, really appreciate it. We went twice as long as we normally do. So thank you so much, Dennis, for having so much information for us tonight. Appreciate it.
It was 4,000 years in 2 hours, so
yeah, not too bad, not too bad.
We'll get to the next 4,000 sometime. But thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I hope to see you. Please come over and visit us anytime. I'd love to see you.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. So this was America's Stonehenge in Salem, New Hampshire. Some of you guys might know it as Mystery Hill. Tonight, my guest was Dennis Stone. This has been Comic Book Radio, episode 231. I'm your host, Peter Cimetti, and I want to tell you guys to have a great night and an even better tomorrow. I'll see you guys soon. All the best.